Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King Adolf, Frederick of Sweden, death by desert. Of all the ways for a monarch to exit this world in battle by betrayal, or on a velvet deathbed surrounded by sobbing nobles, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden chose desert. It was February 1771, a chilly evening, and Adolf Frederick, like many of us after a stressful day of doing absolutely nothing important, decided to treat himself. Except his idea of a treat was a culinary suicide mission. The royal menu that night was ambitious. It began with lobster, then caviar, then sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not one glass. No, several. Enough to make even the royal wig feel dizzy. But none of that killed him. What did he do? 14 servings of semler. Now, if you're not Scandinavian, semler is a sweet roll made of wheat, cardamom, and almond paste, topped with whipped cream and floating in warm milk. It's delicious. It's heavy. It's the kind of dessert you eat one of and say, phew, that's enough. Adolf Frederick had 14. That's not dessert. That's a sugar-based assassination. His servants must have been horrified. Somewhere between roll number 10 and 13, someone surely said, "Your Majesty," perhaps a digestive walk. But the king waved them off, spoon in hand, cream on his lips, determined to go out in style. Then he did. Later that evening, he complained of stomach cramps, which progressed to pain, then collapse, and then the official cause of death, digestive problems. That's putting it mildly. The man ate himself into oblivion. His legacy? A relatively peaceful reign, some administrative reforms, and a title of the king who ate himself to death. You got to hand it to him. There are worse ways to go. He wasn't assassinated. He didn't fall off a horse. He didn't die of plague or a cursed goblet. He was taken out by pastry. And honestly, that's kind of majestic in its own way. So next time you reach for a second slice of cake and hear that little voice in your head say, why not? Just remember King Adolf Frederick and maybe, just maybe, put the spoon down. King George II, the Royal Lou. Exit royalty tends to imagine its final moments with a bit of ceremony, a deathbed farewell, a fading breath whispered in Latin, perhaps a full orchestra humming gently in the background. But King George II of Great Britain? He died on the toilet. Yes, you read that correctly. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. King George II, in his late 70s, woke up feeling a bit off. Still, he followed his usual morning routine, some light conversation, maybe a touch of royal grumbling, and then, as all men must, a visit to the privy. Except he didn't return. Moments later, servants rushed in and found a monarch slumped over the chamber pot. He had suffered a sudden aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the body's largest artery, and died instantly. So yes, technically, he died of natural causes. But the location, unforgiving. Let's take a moment to imagine it. The King of England, Elector of Hanover, defender of the faith, meeting his end. Not in bed, not on horseback, but half-sitting, mid-business, pants at royal half-mast. Hardly the portrait you want framed over the fireplace. To be fair, the chamber pot itself was no peasant's bucket. We're talking porcelain, possibly gold-rimmed, and surely flanked by servants trained in the art of not reacting. But still, it's the kind of death that gets whispered about in footnotes, not sung in ballads. The physicians wrote it up respectfully. The public was told he died of a heart problem, which was technically true. But the full story was preserved thanks to court gossip and a few very honest palace attendants who couldn't let it go. And neither has history, because of all his accomplishments. His wars, his reforms, his reign over an empire. George II is remembered most clearly for being the only British monarch to die on the toilet. A legacy no one asked for, and no one has matched. He ruled an empire and died like a man. Sigurd the Mighty, bitten by a dead man. Some royal deaths are tragic, others are absurd. And then there's Sigurd the Mighty, who managed to die from something even Shakespeare couldn't have invented. A bite from a man who was already dead. Let's rewind to the 9th century. Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, was the Earl of Orkney, a Viking leader, fierce warrior, and all-around Norse tough guy. He spent most of his life raiding, conquering, and terrorizing the northern British Isles. Then one day, he defeated his Scottish enemy, a rival chieftain named Mael Brictor. In a move that screamed Viking confidence and questionable hygiene, Sigurd tied the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy of war. Now, this was a common practice in Viking circles. Brutal, yes, but considered a solid day's work. The problem? Malbright's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home in triumph, the head bounced around, as severed heads tend to do when tied to saddles at some point during the bumpy ride. One of the dead man's teeth scraped Sigurd's leg. Minor cut. Nothing to worry about. If you're not living in the 9th century with zero antibiotics and a complete disregard for infection control, the wild becomes infected fast. And just like that, the victorious Viking, who had slain dozens, conquered territories, and taken down a warlord, died from scratch. Not just any scratch, a posthumous bite. That's not just ironic. That's cosmic slapstick. Imagine being remembered as the war hero who was taken down not by an ambush or a blade, but by a mouth that wasn't even moving anymore. Historians don't know if Sigurd's men laughed, cried, or just quietly untied the head and walked away. Probably all three. Sigurd's story is now a legend, and honestly, it deserves to be. Not because of the conquests, but because he might be the only Viking in history who lost a jewel to dental hygiene. Crown Prince Sardo. Death by rice chest. There are royal deaths that make you chuckle, and then there are those that make you slowly put down your chopsticks. Enter Crown Prince Sardo of Korea, heir to the throne of the Usean dynasty in the 18th century. A young man born into privilege, groomed for power, and eventually remembered as the prince who died inside a box. Not metaphorically, literally. Sardo had issues. Mental health, violent outbursts, erratic behavior. Call it what you will. But the court described him as dangerously unpredictable. He was known to execute servants on a whim and was rumored to wander the palace at night with a sword, muttering to himself. As you can imagine, this made him unpopular. Now his father, King Yongjo, was a Confucian monarch, calm, composed, and painfully concerned with appearances. Executing one's own son would have been politically messy and spiritually scandalous, but leaving him alive, that was even riskier. So that the king came up with a creative solution. He had Sardo placed inside a large wooden rice chest, the kind normally used to store grain. It was mid-July in Korea, for the record. It is not a pleasant climate for enclosed spaces. There was no ventilation, no water, and no hope of a quick end. Sardo survived for 8 agonizing days. No trial, no blade, just a slow seal descent into history as one of the most uncomfortable royal demises ever recorded. It's the kind of death that makes you appreciate exile or even decapitation as a kind option. The official records, cleaned up for posterity, state that Prince Sardo passed away due to divine judgment, which is poetic. But let's be honest, he was rice-boxed to death. Ironically, his son, Jeongjo, would go on to become one of Korea's most celebrated rulers. The family never publicly spoke of the box incident, but historians never forgot. It's a tale of palace politics, mental illness, and tragic cruelty, wrapped in wood and sealed with silence. So next time you're complaining about tight spaces or summer heat, just remember Crown Prince Sardo, and be thankful no one's solving family drama with furniture. King Martin of Aragon, killed by laughter. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow us to introduce you to the one man in history who quite literally overdosed on it. King Martin of Aragon. The year was 1410. Martin, nearing the end of his reign and battling digestive issues because no royal story is complete without gastrointestinal drama, had spent the day in bed, not from injury, but from chronic flatulence and indigestion, the kind of royal wind that clears out courtiers. That evening, he demanded the presence of his personal jester. His request? A joke. Something light, something funny. Anything to lift his bloated spirits. The jester delivered. The joke, as preserved in court accounts, went something like this. "Why did you take so long to arrive?" the king asked. The jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder if it was an act of divine punishment. Now maybe it was the timing." Maybe it was the delirium. Maybe it was the fact that the king hadn't laughed in weeks because he was too busy digesting a goose. But whatever the reason, Martin burst into hysterical laughter, and he didn't stop. Within moments, he was gasping, clutching his stomach, and finally collapsing. The official cause of death? Indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. Yes, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself to death. There's something both tragic and deeply undignified about it. Monarchs are supposed to die heroically on the battlefield, in a marble hall, or at least during a dramatic monologue. Martin, he met his end with a joke about a deer and a fig tree ringing in his ears. The succession crisis that followed his death plunged the crown of Aragon into a political mess, but no one could discuss it without stifling a grim chuckle. His advisors must have struggled to write that report with a straight face. Your Majesty has passed while laughing extremely hard. In the end, Martin's death became legend. Proof that, yes, humor can kill. So laugh wisely, guys, especially after dinner. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, poisoned by immortality. If ever there was a man determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China and the kind of ruler who didn't just dream of immortality, he demanded it. Ruling in the 3rd century BCE, Qin Shi Huang was a powerhouse. He standardized Chinese currency, measurements, and writing. He built roads, walls, and armies. He even commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army, a life-size battalion of clay soldiers designed to protect him in the afterlife, although, as it turns out, he wasn't exactly planning on using them. You see, Qin Shi Huang had no intention of dying. He was obsessed with the idea of living forever, and he tasked his court alchemists and physicians with delivering that dream. Their solution? Mercury pills. Yes, really. Tiny, shimmering, toxic capsules that were marketed as elixirs of immortality. The science behind it? Non-existent, but it had a shiny glow. And in ancient China, shininess often implied power. The emperor, convinced he was drinking life itself, began taking these mercury-based treatments daily. Not occasionally. Daily. The result? His health began to fail. He became paranoid, erratic, and prone to long absences from the court on one of these trips. A secretive inspection of eastern territories where he hoped to find more magical life-extending ingredients. He collapsed and died, poisoned ironically by the very thing he believed would make him eternal. The court panicked. His death was hidden for days to prevent political instability. During that time, to keep the ruse going, his entourage reportedly traveled with a wagon of rotting fish to mask the smell of his rapidly decomposing body. Yes, the emperor who feared death so deeply ended up fermenting next to seafood. To this day, Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains unopened, a literal mountain of secrets. Some scholars believe it may be surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury. Fitting, really. The man wanted to be preserved forever, and in a way he is not an immortal legend, but as a cautionary tale about trusting quack science and glowing pills. Pope John XII, a heavenly scandal. The papacy has seen its fair share of drama, political intrigue, religious reform, crusades, and schisms. But few popes ever reached the level of papal chaos achieved by Pope John XII. Born Octavianus, he became pope in 955 AD at just 18 years old, now becoming the spiritual leader of millions before you're old enough to rent a chariot. Not ideal. And the result? Even less ideal. John XII quickly became known less for sermons and more for scandal. His papal palace reportedly resembled less a seat of Christendom and more a Roman frat house. He gambled. He drank. He allegedly ordained a 10-year-old as bishop. He blessed a man's mistress. He even raised toasts to the devil. During Mass, it's no surprise, then, that his death was equally unorthodox. According to multiple chroniclers, Pope John XII died of a stroke, but not during prayer. Not at the altar. No, he reportedly suffered that stroke while in bed with a married woman. Let that sink in. The Pope died mid-affair with someone else's wife. That's not just scandalous. That's a moral black hole. Now, to be fair, the Vatican never released an official statement confirming this account, possibly because back then, official statements were written by monks who preferred not to die of embarrassment. But the rumor took on a life of its own. Even centuries later, historians couldn't quite agree whether it was the truth or a very juicy smear campaign. But let's say for a moment it was true. Imagine being the priest assigned to write the eulogy. Here lies Pope John XII, shepherd of the faithful, vicar of Christ, and frequent visitor of marital bedrooms. His death marked the end of one of the most infamously unpapal papacies in history. He reigned for just under a decade, and in that short time he managed to blur nearly every line between sacred and profane. And so Pope John XII joins our list not just for how he died, but for how spectacularly he ignored the job description. He came, he sinned, he stroked out, and history will never be forgotten. King Alexander of Greece. Monkey business. Royal duties can be dangerous. War, assassination plots, the occasional poison goblet. But King Alexander of Greece? He was killed by a monkey. Yes, a monkey. It was 1920. Greece was balancing on the edge of political turmoil, and Alexander, a young and relatively inexperienced king, had been placed on the throne while his father was exiled. He wasn't exactly in charge, more like a placeholder in a crown. So imagine the surprise when the news broke. The king had been attacked in the royal gardens by monkeys. Here's how it happened one afternoon. Alexander was walking through the royal estate with his beloved dog. Suddenly, a Barbary macaque, a type of monkey known for being both clever and incredibly short-tempered, appeared. It belonged to a palace worker who apparently didn't see the problem in letting monkeys roam free near royalty. Naturally, the dog and monkey started fighting, and like any loyal pet owner, Alexander tried to break it up. That's when a second monkey appeared. The two monkeys, not thrilled about royal interference, turned on Alexander and bit him repeatedly on the leg. The wounds didn't seem serious at first. He was patched up. No big deal. But days later, infection set in, then gangrene, then sepsis. Within 3 weeks, the King of Greece was dead from a monkey bite. The fallout was immense. His death triggered a constitutional crisis. A return of his father to the throne helped push Greece into further instability. So yes, a monkey attack led to geopolitical chaos. The press at the time didn't know what to do with it. Bitten by a monkey didn't quite fit the traditional royal obituary format, so it was softened. Vague phrases like an unfortunate injury or sudden illness used instead. But the truth? It couldn't be covered up. Alexander's reign had been short and largely uneventful. But his death? Unforgettable. He may have worn a crown, but he was ultimately taken down by 2 small primates who never even got names in the history books. And that's how you become the answer to the strangest trivia question in royal history. Which king was killed by a monkey fight? King Charles II of Navarre. Death by candle. When you think of royal death, you might imagine swords, poison, or at the very least, a dramatic fainting spell after a scandalous banquet. But King Charles II of Navarre, he went out in a way that was both absurd and slightly flammable. Let's set the stage. It's the late 14th century, and Charles II, also known as Charles the Bad, yes, that was his official nickname, wasn't doing so great. He was sick, very sick, possibly suffering from some degenerative illness brought on by a lifetime of political scheming, betrayal, and general unpleasantness. His doctors, equipped with the finest medieval understanding of medicine, which is to say none, came up with a cutting-edge treatment. Wrapped the king from head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. That's right, brandy bandages. Because when in doubt, marinate the monarch. The idea was to warm his body, draw out the illness, and possibly pickle him into health. It might have even worked if the final step hadn't involved sewing him into the linen cocoon and leaving a servant to snip the thread. Enter the candle. The servant, working late by flickering candlelight, leaned in to make the final cut. And then, as court historians describe with both horror and dark amusement, the flame touched the linen. Now remember, the king was soaked in alcohol. He went up like a torch. The servant panicked. There was screaming chaos, probably a few nobles fainting in a corridor. But by the time they extinguished the king, it was too late. Charles II died in one of the most undignified ways possible, accidentally barbecued by his own nurse. The irony was thick. A man who spent his entire life plotting others' downfalls, poisoning rivals, switching alliances, betraying kings, was ultimately undone by his own drip-dry bandage and one inattentive assistant. And so Charles the Bad, who had once ruled with fire and fear, met his end as firewood. Let it be a lesson. Never mix royal treatments with open flame, especially if your nickname is already the Bad. King Edmund II. Death on the Privy. Some royal deaths are dramatic, some are symbolic. And then there's King Edmund II of England, who allegedly met his end in the most vulnerable position a man can be in, sitting on the toilet. Known as Edmund Ironside, because the second just wasn't intimidating enough, he reigned for only 7 months in 1016. His nickname came from his battlefield grit and refusal to yield to Danish invaders, particularly King Kenneth the Great, who was breathing down England's neck at the time. Edmund fought like a lion, enduring defeat, betrayal, and political chaos. He was everything you'd expect from a tough Anglo-Saxon king until the very end, when all that martial glory was overshadowed by what happened in the Privy. According to a persistent and suspiciously detailed medieval rumor, Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet. How? A would-be killer, knowing the king's schedule and digestive reliability, hid beneath the wooden seat. And when Edmund sat down, surprise dagger from below. Gruesome. Yes, dignified. Not remotely. The official record is murky. Some sources say he died of wounds after battle. Others mention an unnamed private treachery. But a few chroniclers, clearly blessed with imagination, describe the whole scenario in remarkable detail, right down to the killer hiding in a cesspit and striking upward. It's the kind of story that feels like political slander. And yet it's stuck because nothing erodes a legacy like death by outhouse ambush. Imagine this scene. Edmund, perhaps humming a victory tune, sitting down after a long campaign, thinking he's finally earned a quiet moment, and then betrayal from below. It's not the stuff of royal murals, it's the stuff of cautionary tavern tales. To be fair, if the assassination tale is true, it was a cunning move. The king is never more defenseless than mid-privy. No armor, no guards, no sword. Just linen, gravity, and unfortunate trust in 11th century plumbing. So whether fact or folklore, Edmund II's death reminds us that even Ironside kings have soft spots, especially when seated King Henry I. Too many eels. Of all the fatal indulgences in royal history, King Henry I of England may take the prize for the most slippery. Because in 1135, the king who had ruled for over 3 decades survived war, political turmoil, and rebellious barons, was finally defeated by, wait for it, a plate of lampreys. If you're not familiar, lampreys are jawless, eel-like fish, with a mouth that looks like it belongs in a medieval torture chamber. They were considered a delicacy back then. Today we'd probably call them nightmare noodles. Henry I, however, loved them. He was known to be absolutely obsessed. His court physicians, who understood very little about medicine but a great deal about guessing, had repeatedly warned him against eating so many of them. They were considered rich food, heavy on digestion, light on survivability. Did Henry listen? Of course not. He was a king. And what's the point of being monarch if you can't defy every medical warning in existence? So during a visit to Normandy, Henry sat down to a grand meal and consumed a surfeit of lampreys, meaning he ate way too many of these slippery, slimy, medieval sea worms. Not fried, not dipped in anything respectable. Likely just boiled and arranged in a grim little pile. Shortly after, he fell violently ill. Abdominal pain, vomiting, fever, the full royal digestive meltdown. Within days, he was dead. The official cause? Food poisoning. His body was embalmed and sent back to England in the winter cold. And there are horrifying details about the journey that we won't get into here. Let's just say preservation was not a strong suit in 12th century Europe. Historians agree he was a capable and often ruthless ruler, but none of that mattered when his love for a grotesque fish dinner landed him 6 feet under. It said his doctors had begged him to avoid the dish. His response? I'd rather die than give up lampreys. Well, mission accomplished. King James II of Scotland, blown up by cannon kings, has died in battle. Kings have died of illness, but King James II of Scotland, he died by standing too close to his own cannon. It was 1460. James was 29 years old, ambitious and known for two things: a famously short temper and a deep love of artillery. This was the golden age of cannon warfare. By golden, we mean wildly unpredictable and prone to spontaneous combustion at the time. James was laying siege to Roxburgh Castle, a stronghold still occupied by the English. Determined to show off his shiny new cannons, James ordered a demonstration and naturally wanted a front row seat. Because what could possibly go wrong when standing a few feet from a 15th century cast iron powder tube packed with explosives? Plenty. As the cannon was being fired, it exploded instantly, violently. Spectacularly, a piece of the barrel tore through James's thigh, severing his leg and, according to some reports, part of his torso. The blast was so intense that it killed him almost instantly. His attendants, probably still trying to process the phrase "Your Majesty just detonated," fled in shock. The king's death threw the Scottish army into temporary chaos, but to their credit, they regrouped and eventually captured the castle. In fact, they later renamed it James's Castle, perhaps as an ironic tribute to the king who donated his limbs to the cause. It was a deeply Scottish and dramatic, loud, and involving at least one piece of medieval technology failing in the most catastrophic way possible. The ironic twist? James had been a huge advocate for modernizing Scotland's artillery. He loved cannons, loved the sound, the smoke, the firepower. He just didn't love basic safety distance. Today, James II is remembered less for his politics and more for being one of the few monarchs in history blown up by his own enthusiasm. Emperor Elagabalus. Too weird to live. If the Roman Empire ever needed a poster child for maybe let's tone it down, it would be Emperor Elagabalus, born Varius of Vitus Bassianus, which already sounds like a spell. He became emperor in 218 AD at just 14 years old. That's right, a teenage emperor. Combine that with near unlimited power, vast wealth, and a complete disregard for anything resembling restraint, and you get one of the most bizarre reigns in Roman history. Elagabalus didn't just bend rules, he melted them down and made jewelry out of them. He appointed a horse as a government official, a trend among Roman eccentrics, and insisted on being called empress instead of emperor, and once invited guests to a feast and dropped rose petals on them until some suffocated. His personal life was just as chaotic. He reportedly married 5 times, including once to a Vestal virgin, which was illegal, and was famous for dressing in women's clothing, wearing makeup and offering money to any physician who could surgically convert him into a woman in modern terms. We might call him gender nonconforming or fluid, but in ancient Rome this made him a scandal wrapped in a toga. While his behavior shocked Roman elites, what really got him in trouble was his disregard for Roman religious traditions. He tried to replace Jupiter, king of the gods, with Elagabal, a sun deity from Syria. He even built a massive temple and made senators watch as he danced around a sacred black stone eventually. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's version of the Secret Service, but with more daggers, had enough. In 222 AD, they assassinated Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, dumped into the Tiber River, and the Roman Empire collectively hit reset. Elagabalus was only 18 when he died, a teenager with too much power, too many parties, and far too little impulse control. Historians still debate whether he was a misunderstood visionary or just a chaotic tornado in a silk robe. But one thing is clear. His reign was too weird, too wild, and for Rome, just too much. Catherine the Great. Rumors that outlived her few rulers in history had reputations as grand or as scandalously misunderstood as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a brilliant reformer, a patron of the arts, a political powerhouse who expanded the Russian Empire and corresponded with Voltaire. But if you mention her name at a dinner party, chances are someone will mumble something about a horse. Let's get this out of the way. No, Catherine did not die in an intimate encounter with a stallion. That myth, persistent, absurd, and thoroughly untrue, was cooked up by her enemies after her death. It has no historical basis and says more about 18th century gossip than it is about Catherine herself. The real story, She died of a stroke in 1796 at the age of 67 while using the toilet. That's it. She collapsed in her private quarters and never regained consciousness. Quiet, undramatic, and very human. But why the horse rumor? Catherine, during her reign, made powerful enemies, both foreign and domestic. She was a woman ruling alone in a male-dominated empire, unapologetically intelligent, and known for her passionate personal life. She had lovers, sure, but so did many kings before her. The difference? Catherine's conquests were documented and scandalized, while her male counterparts were praised for theirs. After her death, political rivals and bitter aristocrats seized the opportunity to undermine her legacy. The horse rumor, vulgar and absurd, was tailor-made for enduring humiliation. It stuck not because it was believable, but because it was too shocking to forget. It's the royal version of a bad tabloid headline that just won't go away. So while Catherine expanded Russia's borders, modernized its administration, and helped drag the empire into the Enlightenment, she's still haunted by one fake equestrian footnote. In the end, she didn't die from the drama. She didn't die in battle. She died like many before her, quietly, privately, and with history refusing to let her go with dignity. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Power is fleeting, but rumors have long legs, especially when they involve horses. Emperor Valentinian II, the bathtub death. No one can explain. Most royal deaths have an explanation: a battle, an illness, a misjudged ill. But Emperor Valentinian II of Rome, his death remains a mystery that's been floating quite literally for over 1,600 years. Let's rewind to the year 392 AD. Valentinian II was only 21 years old. He had technically been emperor since the tender age of 4, because nothing screams qualified to rule the Roman Empire like still being in diapers. But as with most child emperors, someone else was really in charge. That someone was a general named Arbogast. Now, Arbogast wasn't subtle. He was essentially using Valentinian as a puppet while pulling the strings behind the scenes. The young emperor, understandably not thrilled about being a royal mannequin, started pushing back. Tensions rose. Political whispers turned into threats. The palace air got heavy with accidental death energy, and then one morning Valentinian was found dead in his bath. Not in the middle of a lavish feast, not stabbed on the Senate floor, just peacefully drowned in a tub. No bruises, no blood. Just a lifeless young emperor, floating awkwardly like the end of a badly written mystery novel. Arbogast, of course, claimed it was suicide, a convenient and very tidy explanation. Historians, however, have long doubted that story. Valentinian was young, ambitious, and had just begun asserting his authority. Suicide. Unlikely. Political murder. Now that's more Roman. But because no one actually saw it happen, and because forensic science back then amounted to, well, he's not breathing, the true cause of death was never proven. What followed was even messier. The Western Roman Empire plunged into chaos. Arbogast installed a puppet ruler, and yet another civil war ignited, all triggered by a corpse in a bathtub and 100 unanswered questions. Valentinian II's death may not be the most gruesome on our list, or the most absurd, but it wins the prize for most suspicious silence. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. When emperors die in bathtubs, somebody probably helped. In the sun-drenched city of Argos, where marble temples gleamed and the sea breeze tangled with the scent of olive trees, a frail girl named Telesilla was born into a life of quiet expectation. Her family was aristocratic, wealthy enough to afford luxury, educated enough to afford poetry, but their daughter was seen as delicate, sickly, and unlikely to leave much mark on the world beyond the home's shaded courtyards. From a young age, Telesilla suffered from chronic illness. We don't know exactly what plagued her. Ancient records rarely give us such mercy, but she was often bedridden, a passive observer of life's energy from behind linen curtains in a society that prized athleticism and public presence, especially among men. Telesilla's physical weakness could have been a sentence to obscurity, but here's where fate, or perhaps the muses, intervened. Unable to join the bustling life of the agora or the festivals of Hera, Telesilla turned inward, and inward she found poetry. Lines and rhythm became her companions. Words were her resistance. Instead of falling into despair, she began composing verses. Some say with the same fluency others used to breathe. Her poems honored Apollo, Artemis, Athena, divine beings of strategy, healing, and war. It's almost ironic, considering what would come later. And as her poetry deepened, something else changed. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, claimed that through her dedication to the Muses and the act of writing itself, Telesilla's body began to heal. Slowly, steadily, she grew stronger. It's possible that she took part in ritual purification or simply found a purpose that revitalized her. Whatever the reason, she emerged not just as a poet, but as a woman reborn with voice, strength, and startling clarity. In time, her works became widely admired. Her name passed from symposium to symposium, and her lyrics stirred something deep in the hearts of Argive women. She wasn't just crafting verse, she was crafting identity. She gave her city its voice, and though no one could know it yet, that voice would soon echo not in the theater, but on the battlefield. Because this poetess wasn't done surprising the world, not by a long shot. As Telesilla's name grew within Argos, her home became a place of quiet reverence, not for wealth or beauty, but for her words. She wrote with a particular focus on the gods, especially Apollo and Artemis, the divine siblings of healing, precision, and purity. Her hymns didn't merely praise, they invoked presence. These were not empty rituals. These were spiritual calls to alms of the soul. Her verses were likely recited at temples and sacred festivals, sung by choruses of young women dressed in white, their voices rising beneath sun-scorched columns. Through her poetry, Telesilla provided not only spiritual expression, but also emotional education. She reminded the people of Argos, especially its women, that they too were part of the divine tapestry. They weren't merely spectators in a male-dominated mythos. They were woven into the narrative, and while men debated politics in the Agora, it was Telesilla's verses that seeped into the minds of Argive daughters. In a world where education for women was rare, poetry was their inheritance. Her hymns taught them reverence, strength, even defiance, wrapped delicately in metaphor and rhythm. But it was more than just literature. For Telesilla, these hymns were medicine. Ancient accounts suggest that her devotion to poetic discipline helped cure her lifelong illness. Though we might roll our eyes at the idea of writing your way to health, there's something timeless in this concept. She found purpose, and perhaps in doing so, she found resilience. The more she wrote, the more she stood. The more she stood, the more people listened. And Argos needed her voice because war was coming. The city had been growing complacent, leaning too heavily on its past glories and underestimating the tensions rising around it. Sparta, that eternal neighbor to the south, had already shown its teeth more than once. And while the men of Argos continued their debates, no one suspected that a poet, the once sickly girl who healed herself with verse, would soon become their rallying cry. In many ways, Telesilla was already preparing her city. Her hymns didn't just soothe, they steeled. They became quiet rehearsals for something louder, bloodier, and more urgent. When the time came, the women of Argos would already know the rhythm of defiance, because she had already taught them how to sing it. The year was around 494 BCE, and Argos stood on the edge of disaster. Tensions with Sparta had finally snapped. The Battle of Sapae erupted, an ambush staged with Spartan precision and Argive miscalculation. The Argive men, confident in their numbers and tradition, fell into a trap laid by King Cleomenes of Sparta. It was brutal, systematic, a massacre dressed in strategy. Hundreds of Argive soldiers were slaughtered. Some say nearly the entire male fighting force of the city was wiped out. What remained was a shell of a city, its gates open, its warriors dead, its fate seemingly sealed. Argos lay defenseless, and Sparta knew it. What Cleomenes didn't know, what perhaps no one could have predicted, was that behind those bloodied city walls was not just grief and ruin. There was Telesilla. In the aftermath of the battle, as wails of mourning echoed through marble halls and temples, it would have been easy, expected even for the people of Argos, to surrender. Many probably considered it, but somewhere among the collapsed morale, Telesilla stepped forward, not with a spear, but with fire in her eyes. She rallied the women. The story, preserved in fragments by later historians like Plutarch and Pausanias, is nothing short of astounding. Telesilla, the poetess once confined by illness, now stood before her fellow citizens, mothers, daughters, widows, and called them to arms. Literally. They gathered every weapon they could find, spears once mounted on walls, shields left behind by the fallen. Even stones and farming tools were repurposed. And in the shadow of that ancient city, Women began training the elderly, the young, even the servants. They all prepared for what was coming. Telesilla organized it. This wasn't some mythic fever dream. It was a strategy. She positioned women in atop battlements to give the illusion that Argos was still fully defended. She drilled them in formations. They were not trained soldiers, but they were fierce, determined, and above all, furious. The city waited. Breath held. The Spartans would return. Everyone knew it. But when they did, expecting a broken city ready to kneel, they found something else entirely. A wall lined with women, armed, prepared, led by a poet with no crown, no title, just command in her voice. Argos had fallen, and now it would rise again. The Spartan army returned, expecting plunder. After all, they had decimated Argos's military. What remained, they assumed, were civilians too broken to fight back. An easy conquest, maybe even a lesson in Spartan mercy. But what greeted them at the gates of Argos was no surrender. It was a spectacle. It was defiance. It was Telesilla. The walls were lined with women, fully armed, their eyes steady, their posture unshaken. Their commander, a woman once known only for poetry, now stood tall, directing strategy like a general born of war. And then the women attacked. The battle was not elegant. This was not the Homeric ideal of shield walls and bronze-plated honor. It was chaos furious, unrelenting, and intimate. These women fought with whatever they had. Spears stabbed from above the ramparts. Boiling water scalded Spartan helmets. Stones rained like curses. It was as much psychological as it was physical. The Spartans, trained for disciplined combat against soldiers, were suddenly locked in brutal melee with people they were not prepared to kill women. And that hesitation cost them. Pausanias, who recorded the tale centuries later, wrote that the women of Argos, under Telesilla's leadership, forced the Spartans to retreat. It sounds improbable, doesn't it? But context matters. The Spartans had won their main objective. They had already defeated Argos's male army. What they faced now was resistance that risked shattering the legend of Spartan invincibility. To lose men to a citizen militia led by women wasn't just dangerous. It was humiliating, and humiliation in Sparta was worse than death. So they withdrew. Let that settle for a moment. Telesilla, a poet, trained not in arms but in verse, had led a group of grieving, enraged, determined women and saved a city. Not in myth, not in allegory, but in recorded human history. This victory wasn't just military. It was symbolic. It changed the narrative of Argos. It redefined what women could do in the face of devastation. And it proved something Sparta hadn't expected. That courage doesn't wear a beard, and leadership isn't born only on the battlefield. That day, Argos didn't fall to Sparta. It stood taller than ever, held up by hands that had once only held lyres. And it was Telesilla who handed the city its second breath. Victory had a strange taste. The city of Argos had survived, but it was changed. Its streets still echoed with grief. Its temples bore the bloodstains of husbands, brothers, and sons who never came home. But over all that silence stood something remarkable, a new kind of legacy, stitched together by women's hands and Telesilla's unshakable resolve. She didn't claim power. She didn't crown herself queen or sit upon a throne. Telesilla returned to her poetry. It might seem anticlimactic, but this was precisely her genius. She didn't fight for personal glory. She fought because her city needed her. And once Argos was safe, she resumed what she loved, composing hymns and honoring the gods. But now her verses had new weight. They weren't just lyrics sung at festivals. They were reminders, living memories set to meet her. Imagine the girls of Argos growing up in the shadow of that victory, whispering stories of the poet general who once led their mothers into battle. Imagine their voices reciting her verses under moonlight, not just as ritual, but as power. Telesilla's poetry had become prophecy, and prophecy had become precedent. The city honored her not just in song, but in stone. A statue was erected in the temple of Aphrodite, showing Telesilla seated calmly with scrolls at her feet, one hand upon her lyre, the other resting on her shield, not as a contradiction, but as a complete truth. She was both artist and warrior, and she had shown her city that those identities were not only compatible, they were necessary. Elsewhere in Greece, the story spread. Telesilla became a symbol not only of Argive resilience, but of womanly courage in a world that rarely allowed such narratives to breathe. Philosophers debated her. Poets echoed her themes, and in time, her name was preserved in collections of heroic women, standing shoulder to shoulder with queens and oracles. But perhaps most powerful of all was the silence that followed. She didn't chase war. She didn't have a court conflict. Her defense of Argos was an act of necessity, not ego. When peace returned, so did she. To her ink, to her rhythm, to the private sacred space where poems were born. And in doing so, she proved that real strength isn't measured in how long you hold a sword, but in knowing exactly when to put it down. Telesilla's name began to stretch beyond the city walls of Argos, carried not by armies, but by admirers. Her story, part history, part legend, was whispered in symposiums, etched into scrolls, and retold in hushed admiration by men who never thought they'd speak of a woman as both poet and protector. She was not mythologized into a goddess. She remained human, and that made her all the more powerful. Her dual legacy resonated deeply across the Greek world because it broke a mold that many didn't realize could be broken. In an era when women were expected to be silent, invisible, or ornamental, Telesilla was none of those things. She was educated, expressive, and when the moment came, fierce. And yet even her poetry was not lost to time. Some of her verses survived, cited by later grammarians and scholars. Though fragmentary, they suggest a rich, reverent tone, filled with invocations of the divine, vivid imagery, and a deep understanding of ritual. She didn't just write, she shaped the sacred. It's difficult to say how much of her work has vanished into history's abyss. Like so many women of antiquity, her voice was preserved only in pieces, filtered through the pens of men centuries after her death. But even these remnants are enough. They speak of a woman who believed in beauty, in community, in purpose, and in the capacity of language to build more than verse, to build courage, memory, resistance. Artists later depicted her surrounded by scrolls and shields, sometimes crowned with laurel, sometimes simply sitting alone in contemplation, always poised between song and silence, art and action. She inspired later generations of women, though subtly like a steady flame that never quite goes out. In the Hellenistic period, and even into Roman times, her name appeared in anthologies, a rare inclusion among lists dominated by male voices. Her story wasn't repeated out of novelty. It was repeated because it mattered. Telesilla of Argos wasn't the loudest warrior, nor the most prolific poet, but she was something rarer, a woman who moved between two worlds with grace, fire, and intent. And in doing so, she forced the world to take notice, not with conquest, but with clarity. As centuries passed, the name Telesilla began to fade, not from legend, but from mainstream history. Like so many women of the ancient world, her memory was tucked into footnotes, her achievements mentioned only in fragments, and often with a tone of polite surprise, as though it was somehow an accident that a woman had done something remarkable. The Hellenistic world, with its shifting power centers and cultural transformations, began favoring different kinds of heroes, conquerors, philosophers, kings. In this new climate, a woman poet who defended her city with wit and didn't quite fit the mold of the stories that empires like to tell. By the time Roman authors picked up her name, it was almost folkloric. Plutarch mentions her with a kind of rhetorical curiosity, less interested in her verse or her politics, and more in the idea that a woman had ever wielded command at all. To him and many of his contemporaries, Telesilla was an anomaly, a remarkable exception, a rare flower in a man's garden. But this is where history itself betrays us. Because it wasn't just Telesilla who vanished from the center of the narrative. There were countless women like her leaders, thinkers, poets, whose stories were deemed too inconvenient to preserve in full. The scrolls were lost. The statues were repurposed or destroyed. The voices were silenced, not by violence, but by centuries of editorial neglect. And yet Telesilla persisted. Her story survived not because it was allowed to, but because it was too compelling to kill. Because the image of a woman standing atop a city wall, shield in one hand, verse in the other, simply refuse to go quietly. That kind of image doesn't disappear. It smolders in memory, reignites in times of crisis, and whispers to each new generation that bravery wears many faces, and some of them wear veils. In modern times, historians and feminists alike have begun to revisit her legacy, not to exaggerate it, but to reclaim it, to dust off the silence and examine what happens when we let the full weight of a woman's story stand beside her male counterparts. And in doing so, we don't just remember Telesilla. We remember what history tried to forget. Though much of ancient Greece has crumbled, its statues worn smooth, its scrolls turned to dust, Telesilla's legacy still lingers in three enduring forms: stone, scroll, and sisterhood. First, the stone. In the ancient sanctuary of Aphrodite in Argos, long after the war cries faded, the statue of Telesilla once stood, not a grand marble colossus, but a thoughtful monument. She was depicted seated calmly, her scrolls scattered at her feet, her hand resting on a helmet. No raised sword, no dramatic stance, just a moment of stillness. An image of a woman who had mastered both art and action. Even the placement in Aphrodite's temple was deliberate. Not Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and perhaps here, resilience. It was a quiet revolution carved in stone. Then came the scrolls. Though most of Telesilla's poetry is lost, what little remains reveals a voice rich with reverence and clarity. Scholars across centuries have tried to piece together her verses, finding in them not only artistic merit, but emotional insight. Her style belonged to the lyric tradition, intimate, melodic. Charged with spiritual devotion, she was not writing for spectacle. She was writing for the soul, and perhaps that's why her words survived longer than her battles. And finally, the sisterhood. Telesilla's story became a kind of coded anthem for women through the ages, especially for those denied swords, votes, or recognition. She offered something more enduring than strategy. Permission. Permission to act, to speak, to lead, to protect. She wasn't just a historical figure. She was a mirror, one in which generations of women could see their own potential reflected, no matter how obscure by time. Her tale has inspired plays, poems, even academic treatises. In feminist readings of ancient history, she is no longer a footnote. She is a cornerstone, a reminder that when institutions fall silent, individuals can still shout that when history closes a door. Memory opens a window. In classrooms, in books, in whispered conversations among those hungry for forgotten heroines, Telesilla lives on. She is the patroness of the underestimated, the poet who chose not only to sing of heroes, but to become one. Telesilla never asked to be remembered. She didn't command monuments or beg for her name to be etched in history. And yet, here we are, over 2,000 years later, still speaking her name, still telling her story, still awed by what she did in a world that tried to forget her kind. What makes her legacy so compelling is not just that she fought or that she wrote, but that she did both when neither was expected nor allowed of someone like her. The sickly girl with a lyre was never supposed to lead a militia. A woman who composed hymns wasn't meant to rewrite the fate of a city. But she did. And not through divine intervention or noble birth, but through clarity, purpose, and grit. In the grand tapestry of Greek history, full of heroes with bronze muscles and flowing capes, Telesilla stand apart. She doesn't roar like Achilles or scheme like Odysseus. She does something far harder. She holds the line. She looks into the face of collapse, and she does not flinch. Not because she was fearless, but because someone had to act and no one else did. And that's what makes her echo last. She reminds us that heroism doesn't always come with trumpet blast or a poet's blessing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman who picks up a sword with shaking hands, steadies herself, and says, "Not today." Today, scholars and creatives alike continue to draw inspiration from her. Her story is taught in feminist studies, referenced in discussions about women in warfare, and even invoked in debates about the fluidity of roles across gender and class. She has become not just a symbol of Argos, but of resistance itself. And if you listen carefully, her voice still hums beneath the surface of modern tales in every woman who steps up when others step back. In every artist who refuses to stay in their lane, In every act of courage that begins with a whisper and ends in thunder, Talasilla's legacy is not locked in the past. It is alive, breathing, moving quietly through the world. Because the truth is, the lyre was never put down. It was simply transformed into something sharper before arches. Before blueprints, before even the idea of architecture, there was a simple human need to get from one side to the other. Across rushing rivers, deep ravines, and perilous chasms, the early ancestors of humanity faced a question as old as travel itself. How do you cross when the land disappears? The very first bridges were not built by engineers. They were stumbled upon by wanderers and hunters who noticed a fallen tree spanning a stream, or watched vines drape across a gorge. These early crossings weren't planned. They were found. Nature gave the hint. Humans took the cue. A fallen log, a line of stones placed just right. This was where bridges were born. Out of curiosity, out of fear, out of hunger. Over time, those accidental crossings became intentional in rainforests. People began binding together vines and reeds to form hanging footpaths. These weren't exactly stable. You wouldn't want to cross one in the dark, but they were a beginning, a literal lifeline between food and famine, isolation and community. In parts of what is now South America, early civilizations began using twisted plant fibers to create longer suspended crossings. These weren't just primitive ropes, they were woven. Reinforced and tested with centuries of refinement, the Incas, long before the Spanish conquest, perfected the art of the rope bridge. But even before the Inca Empire, the peoples of the Andes were mastering techniques that required deep understanding of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials. What makes these early bridges remarkable is not their size, but their boldness. Imagine looking at a river gorge hundreds of feet deep, and instead of walking away, you begin tying grass together. That's not just ingenuity. It's a kind of bravery wrapped in necessity. These first crossings changed more than routes. They changed relationships. Once two valleys were linked, ideas flowed as easily as people. Trade routes emerged. Languages mingled. Cultural exchange was born on shaky ropes and damp planks, a bridge. Even the humblest one is always more than wood and fiber. It's an invitation, a statement, a quiet refusal to let nature have the final say. In those earliest spans, civilizations took their first steps toward connection and never looked back. High in the Andes Mountains, where cliffs drop like knives and rivers roar with glacier melt, the Inca Empire wove its own answer to nature's brutal geography. The Incas didn't just build bridges, they tied the sky together. Their roads ran for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys. But it was the rope bridges, or Corswasaka, that truly defied imagination. These bridges were made entirely of grass, not wood, not metal, not stone, just woven strands of ichu, a tough mountain grass twisted into cords, and those cords twisted into cables. The process wasn't just technical. It was ceremonial. Entire villages would gather once a year to build or rebuild these bridges by hand. Each family was responsible for a section of rope. They braided, chanted, and hauled, working in a rhythm passed down through generations. The resulting bridge could stretch across a 100-foot canyon, swaying with every gust of mountain wind. No nails, no bolts, just pure tension and trust. And yet these rope bridges were strong enough to support llamas, soldiers, messengers, and traders. They were the beating arteries of an empire, spanning canyons where no stone could be placed. And they were elegant in their own way. Suspended like cobwebs across the void, they moved with the wind instead of fighting it. They bent, swayed, and sighed, but rarely broke when one did collapse. It wasn't treated as a failure. It was simply the end of a cycle, ready to be born again by the hands of those who lived along its path. These rope bridges weren't just infrastructure, they were sacred. The annual rebuilding was a living ritual, a reminder that the land was not to be conquered, but worked with. That connection required not brute force, but harmony. No empire understood this better than the Incas. Even today, one rope bridge remains in use, the last Quezhuachaca, still rebuilt annually by local communities near Junchiri, Peru. UNESCO has recognized it as an intangible cultural heritage. Tourists cross it gingerly. Locals cross it with muscle memory. In a world that increasingly forgets how to repair, the Inca Bridge reminds us of something ancient and vital, that strength doesn't always come from stone. Sometimes it comes from woven grass, shared labor, and the will to meet across the void. Far from the wind-tossed Andes, across the rivers of ancient China, another philosophy of bridge building was taking root, one that favored permanence over flexibility, symmetry over sway. Chinese engineers saw bridges not just as tools, but as expressions of balance, of earth, water, and heaven. Connected in stone, as early as the Zhou dynasty, Chinese builders had been experimenting with wooden and pontoon bridges. But it was during the Han and later the Sui and Tang dynasties that something extraordinary emerged. The segmental arch bridge. Unlike the steep Roman arch, which relied on a high curve, the Chinese approach flattened the arch, giving their bridges a gentle rise and greater stability under dynamic loads like carts and animals. These were not just aesthetic choices. They were masterclasses in tension and compression. Take, for example, the Xiaozhou Bridge, built in the early 7th century by the engineer Li Chun. Spanning 123 feet with a 37-foot high arch, it remains one of the oldest surviving open spandrel stone bridges in the world. It's not just old, it's brilliant. Li Chun designed it with smaller secondary arches along the base to reduce weight and water resistance during floods. His understanding of both structure and natural forces was centuries ahead of his time. But Chinese bridges weren't only feats of engineering, they were deeply poetic. Many were built near temples or gardens, reflecting ideals of Taoist harmony and Confucian order. The bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was a moment, a pause between destinations, the chance to contemplate the still water below and the swirling heavens above. Stone lions often guarded the entrances, not merely as decoration, but as symbols of protection. Bridge names were chosen with care, often invoking luck, longevity, or spiritual awakening. And for scholars and artists of the Tang and Song dynasties, bridges became a favorite subject in painting and verse. A simple walk across one could become a metaphor for everything change, connection, and the quiet strength of staying still amid motion. In ancient China, bridges were more than civil works. They were spiritual geometry, each stone laid not just with skill, but with philosophy. To cross one wasn't just to travel, it was to pass through balance itself. If China built with harmony, Rome built with ambition. For the Romans, a bridge wasn't just a way to cross a river, it was a declaration. We are here and we will stay. As the Roman Empire expanded, it faced an endless parade of rivers, valleys, and gorges. But where others saw obstacles, Rome saw blueprints. The Romans took what the Etruscans had started, arch technology, and turned it into something monumental and permanent. Using stone, concrete, and sheer willpower, Roman engineers constructed bridges that didn't just survive time, they defined it. One of the most famous is the Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BCE, which still carries foot traffic across the Tiber River today. That's more than 2 millennia of wear and war, flood and footstep, and still standing. The genius of the Roman bridge lay in its arch. A Roman arch distributed weight evenly, channeling force into the ground. It allowed bridges to span wider rivers and support heavier loads. And with the invention of post-plant concrete, which could be set underwater, Roman builders gained flexibility their rivals couldn't match. But function was never enough for Rome. These bridges were built with grandeur. They were often faced with marble or limestone, inscribed with the names of emperors, adorned with statues and triumphal messages. Some were even designed as part of aqueducts, like the breathtaking Pont du Gard in modern-day France, which served as both a water channel and a towering architectural statement. For Roman legions, bridges meant speed. For Roman merchants, they meant prosperity, and for the empire itself, they meant permanence. The roads of Rome were famously straight and unyielding, but it was the bridges that made those roads matter. Wherever Rome went, it bridged the gap, literally and metaphorically, between conquest and civilization. A bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was an empire in miniature, orderly, strong, and built to last. Even after the empire fell, many Roman bridges remained in use. Rebuilt, reimagined, the stones whispered of a time when engineers walked hand in hand with emperors, and when rivers, no matter how wide or wild, bowed to the Roman will. To cross a Roman bridge was to walk in the footsteps of conquerors, and to feel the weight of eternity under your feet. While Rome built in stone and China in symmetry, ancient India quietly cultivated a bridge tradition that was unlike anything else on earth. Bridges made from trees, not cut wood, not rope, not carved beams. Living, growing trees. In the wet, hilly region of Meghalaya in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, rivers are fed by relentless monsoons. Flash floods sweep away the bamboo, rope, and timber bridges with ease. But centuries ago, the Khasi and Jayantia peoples found a way to use nature not as an obstacle, but as a partner. They began guiding the roots of the Ficus elastica tree, a type of rubber fig, across streams and rivers. Slowly, patiently. Over years, then decades, the roots were trained using hollowed-out tree trunks, scaffolding, and bamboo frames to grow toward the opposite bank. When the roots met, they were woven and anchored into the soil, creating a bridge that was quite literally alive. These living root bridges didn't rot. They didn't splinter, in fact. They grew stronger with age. A young bridge might take 15 years to become usable, but once mature, it could last hundreds of years, sustained by the very land it stood on. This was not fast architecture. It was generational. A grandfather would begin weaving a bridge that his grandchildren might one day walk across. There was no blueprint, only tradition, no calculation, only intuition passed down through watching, doing, and remembering. And these bridges weren't just functional. They were breathtaking. Suspended among waterfalls and emerald valleys, the root bridges curved and twisted like something from a fairy tale, organic and surreal, blending into the jungle as if grown by myth. In a world that often values speed, India's living bridges are a defiant slow song. They show that time, care, and cooperation with nature can produce wonders just as lasting as stone. They are community projects, sacred paths, a reminder that not all strength is rigid. Some of it is woven, flexible, and alive. To cross a root bridge is to cross into a different rhythm of civilization, one that listens to the earth rather than reshaping it. And in that quiet balance, India bridged more than rivers. It bridged the wild itself. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved ribbons through desert and city, early Mesopotamians faced a familiar problem: rivers that both nourished and separated. These waterways brought trade, irrigation, and life, but they also created boundaries. And where boundaries exist, someone eventually builds a bridge. Unlike the later empires of stone and steel, ancient Mesopotamians worked with what they had: mud, brick, timber, and ingenuity. Their rivers were broad, but not bottomless. Their materials were fragile, but their minds were not. The city of Babylon, one of the jewels of ancient Mesopotamia, was famously divided by the Euphrates River, but it was also famously connected. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Babylon had an early movable bridge constructed of wooden planks laid across boats and tied together with papyrus ropes by day. It ferried people and carts. By night, it was dismantled to prevent enemy access. Whether this account is precise or poetic reflects the truth. Mesopotamian cities were not isolated settlements. They were logistical masterpieces. Bridges here were not just structures, they were strategies. Some were built low and temporary, designed to be rebuilt after floods. Others were made with baked bricks and asphalt mortar, resting on foundations driven deep into silt and clay. Mesopotamians understood the river's moods. They didn't try to conquer water with brute force. They tried to work around it, above it, and sometimes even under it. Trade caravans carrying grain, textiles, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats drew pilgrims from opposite shores. And kings, forever in need of control, understood that whoever held the bridge controlled the city. Over time, as empires like the Assyrians and Persians rose, their bridges grew in complexity. Engineers began incorporating stone piers and more permanent wooden spans, but the roots of that engineering went back to the simplest acts: bundling reeds, piling clay, stretching logs. The logic of bridging the why came long before the how. Mesopotamian bridges may not have survived the centuries like Rome's or inspired poetry like China's, but they formed a vital foundation. They were among the first expressions of infrastructure, the bones of organized society. They taught us that where there is commerce, there must be connection, and where there is water, someone will always try to walk across it. To the ancient Greeks, the world was not just a place to live. It was a canvas to be shaped, measured, and perfected. And when it came to bridges, they brought the same thoughtful attention to proportion, harmony, and engineering that they poured into their temples and sculptures. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks weren't obsessed with spanning vast distances or showcasing imperial power. Their bridges were often more modest, but no less intelligent. Built across small rivers, marshes, or rocky gaps, these structures were crafted with an elegant balance of form and function. Take the Arcadico Bridge, located in the Peloponnese. Dating back to the Bronze Age, around 1300 BCE, it's one of the oldest surviving arch bridges in the world. Built of large, unmortared limestone boulders, the bridge still stands today, quietly carrying foot traffic as it did millennia ago. There are no inscriptions, no imperial eagles, no towering arches, just a single subtle span built with precision and enduring grace. The Greeks understood stone, they understood load-bearing, and perhaps most importantly, they understood the importance of community connectivity. Many of their early roads and bridges were part of sacred routes used during religious festivals and processions to temples, such as the long journey to Delphi or Olympia in these contexts. A bridge wasn't just about moving people. It was about guiding them toward the divine. Later, during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek cities began incorporating more advanced engineering methods, borrowing and adapting Etruscan and Eastern techniques. Timber and stone were used together. Some bridges even included drainage systems, careful grading, and guardrails. Still, aesthetics mattered. A Greek bridge didn't just serve a function, it fit into the landscape, enhancing rather than dominating it. It was common to find bridges positioned for viewing, often offering perfect symmetry with the surrounding hills and sky. Water below, air above, and stone in between. The Greeks liked their elements balanced. In Greek thought, the bridge became more than a crossing. It was a metaphor, a movement between worlds, between cities, between gods and mortals, between chaos and order. So while their spans may not stretch as far as Rome's, the Greek bridge stands as a quiet whisper in stone, strong, serene, and built with thought rather than thunder. In the land of towering pyramids and mighty pharaohs, ancient Egypt didn't need to conquer rivers as often as it needed to navigate them. The Nile, both giver and taker of life, served more as a highway than a barrier. Boats were the bridges of Egypt, but that didn't mean Egyptians ignored the art of crossing land-based gaps. When they did build bridges, they did so with intention and with unmistakable symbolism. Egyptian civilization grew along the fertile banks of the Nile, where irrigation channels, canals, and distributaries carved up the land. To manage this watery maze, the Egyptians developed small-scale bridges, flat stone causeways, wooden crossings, and canal bridges designed more for function than spectacle. One of the earliest known examples comes from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists have discovered narrow stone walkways and raised paths designed to carry foot traffic over irrigation ditches and sunken terrain. These weren't monumental in size, but they were smartly built, using local stone, carefully leveled surfaces, in alignment with prevailing routes. And then there's the Great Causeways, those long sloping stone paths that connected the Nile to the pyramids at Giza. While technically not bridges, these structures acted as ceremonial links between the river and the tombs of the dead. Massive and meticulously constructed, these causeways were used to transport the pharaoh's funerary goods chariots, and even his mummified body during grand religious processions. In these causeways we see something more than transport. We see spiritual transition, a passage from life to death, from one world to another. The bridge in Egypt wasn't always a structure you walked across. It was an idea. The soul crossed into the afterlife. The king moved from mortal dust to divine eternity as Egypt expanded and urbanized. More bridges appeared over canals and smaller water networks, often tied to temple precincts or granary systems. Some were likely made of wood lost to time, but their foundations, stone piers and embankments, remained buried beneath desert and field. The Egyptian bridge was never a monument to conquest. It was a conduit of water, of grain, of sacred memory, not grand in form, perhaps, but monumental in what it represented. The eternal journey between shores, seen and unseen. By the time the ancient world began to fade into the medieval, its bridges remained quiet, immovable witnesses to the ambitions, fears and brilliance of early civilizations. Some crumbled, buried by flood or forgotten war. Others, remarkably, still stand. A root bridge in India, a Roman arch in France, a Greek limestone span in the Peloponnese, silent but unbroken. What unites all these ancient bridges, whether born of grass, stone, wood, or myth, is that they were acts of faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but human faith. That we could overcome separation, that we could connect what nature had divided, that the people on the other side were worth reaching. Every civilization had its own approach. The Incas used tension. The Romans used compression. The Chinese used curvature. The Mesopotamians used buoyancy. But the principle was the same. Link what cannot be left, make distance irrelevant. And each bridge said something about the people who built it. The Incas trusted time. The Greeks trusted balance. The Egyptians trusted eternity. The Romans, they trusted concrete, but even beyond function and philosophy. Bridges told stories. A rope bridge whispered of the community. A Roman aqueduct thundered the empire. A Chinese stone arch spoke of harmony. They didn't just carry bodies. They carried beliefs, identities, and purpose. Some bridges were born in urgency, built quickly after a war or flood. Others were born in ritual, raised in song, rebuilt in ceremony, maintained not by kings, but by farmers and children. All of them required cooperation. No one builds a bridge alone. You need hands, patience, and hope. And perhaps that's why they still resonate with us today. Not because we're impressed by ancient tools or clever math, but because we recognize the courage it takes to build something between danger and safety, between isolation and unity, between now and the generations to come. In a world that often pulls itself apart, ancient bridges remind us of something quieter, older, and wiser. That connection is worth the effort. That strength can be gentle. That's sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply reach out. So the next time you cross an old bridge, pause. You're walking on the remains of ancient dreams, and they're still holding. Before there were words carved into clay or hymns sung in stone temples, there was sound. Not organized music in the way we know it, but raw, instinctive rhythm. Nature's own symphony waiting to be noticed. The crackling of fire, the patterned drip of rain, the rustle of leaves, the rhythmic thump of feet. These were the first instruments, and somewhere along the way, early humans stopped just listening. They started imitating. The earliest musical instruments known to us come from the Paleolithic period. Among them, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, found in caves in Germany and dated to over 40,000 years ago. They had holes carefully drilled along their bodies, designed to control pitch, not just make noise. These weren't toys. They were tools of emotion. Imagine it in the flickering dark of a cave, someone gently blowing into a carved bone, the notes echoing like whispers through stone, a lullaby for a child. A chant for the hunt, a sound to soothe the dying or stir the sacred. These first notes weren't just entertainment, they were memories made audible. Early music likely served functional roles. Rhythmic clapping or drumming could synchronize group labor, build morale, or intimidate enemies. Repetition made things memorable. Long before writing, information was sung, not said. Melody was a mnemonic device, anchoring knowledge to tone and pattern. The beginning of oral tradition is, in many ways, the beginning of music. In tribal rituals across ancient cultures, we see evidence of percussion instruments, wooden slats, seed rattles, stretched animal skin struck in time. These tools helped bind communities together, providing a shared experience that required no translation. You didn't need to speak the same language to move to the same beat. Music likely emerged alongside and intertwined with spiritual belief. In early burials, we find instruments placed beside the dead, flutes, drums, bells, as if the journey to the next world required accompaniment. Or perhaps the music was meant for the living, echoing with grief, hope, or a longing to reach beyond the veil. In these earliest sounds, we weren't just surviving, we were beginning to express ourselves, to remember, to celebrate, to mourn. Before we built cities or wrote myths, we sang in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved paths of life through desert and clay. Music was not a pastime. It was a necessity. From Sumer to Babylon, from temple to tavern, sound shaped identity, order, and the divine. The Mesopotamians didn't just play music. They recorded it, structured it, and tied it tightly to the heavens. Among the earliest visual records of musical culture comes from Sumerian cylinder seals and reliefs, dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. These tiny artworks depict musicians holding lyres, flutes, and drums. But the true marvel lies in what archaeologists later uncovered, the lyres of Uar. Elaborate instruments adorned with gold, lapis lazuli, and carved bull heads. These were not mere tools. They were sacred objects buried with the elite, meant to accompany souls into the afterlife. The Mesopotamian lyre was delicate and resonant. Its strings stretched across a wooden frame and played with it, plucking fingers or bone picks. Musicians were professionals, some temple-trained, others court-appointed. Music accompanied rituals, coronations, banquets, and battle. Every occasion had its sound. And then there's the real marvel, notation. A clay tablet from Ugarit, dated to around 1400 BCE, is considered one of the world's oldest surviving examples of written music. It contains hymns inscribed in cuneiform, not only with lyrics, but musical instructions using a system of relative pitch. We don't fully understand how to hear it as the ancients did, but the very fact it exists reveals how central music was to structure and spirituality. Music was also tied to cosmology. Numbers mattered, intervals mattered. Ancient Mesopotamian thinkers like those in Babylon believed music could reflect the order of the cosmos. Mirroring the same harmony that kept planets in orbit and seasons on time, this idea would ripple into Greek philosophy centuries later. Whether sung by priestesses to Inanna or played by traveling minstrels in crowded markets, music in Mesopotamia was layered. It was professional, sacred, celebratory, and political. It carried messages between mortals and gods in a world carved from mud and mystery. Music gave shape to things unseen, binding memory to ritual, order to time, and the soul to its story. In ancient Egypt, where gods had animal heads and pharaohs were divine, music flowed like the Nile, constant, sacred, and life-giving. It echoed in temple courts, drifted through market stalls, and accompanied every stage of human life from birth to burial. Egyptian music wasn't ornamental. It was essential. The Egyptians believed that music had magical properties. It could calm the gods, heal the sick, and guide the dead. Instruments were gifts from the divine, most famously the goddess Hathor, often depicted with a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument used in sacred rites. To shake the sistrum was to awaken life itself. Its jingling tone symbolized the cosmic rhythm of creation. Archaeologists have found harps, flutes, lutes, and lyres painted in two murals dating back to the Old Kingdom around 2500 BCE. These instruments weren't generic. They were specific, finely crafted, and richly decorated. Harps came in angular or curved forms, often played sitting on the ground. Their strings, made from animal gut, sang out during both religious ceremonies and court entertainment. Music was deeply woven into Egyptian ritual. Temple hymns were performed at sunrise to greet the gods. Priests and priestesses weren't just readers of sacred texts, they were also trained musicians. Specific tones were believed to align with particular gods or emotions. There was music for lamentation, for praise, for purification. Every act had its sound, but music wasn't just for the elitists. Musicians, dancers, and folk singers filled the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Percussion instruments like frame drums, clappers, and castanets added rhythm to community festivals. Women often led in performance, whether as professional entertainers or as mourners hired to sing the wails of grief at funerals. Egyptian hieroglyphs even give us words for musical moods. He implied joy or adoration. Tefu meant sorrow or mourning. Music wasn't an abstract art form. It was emotional infrastructure. And when death came, it came with music. Funerary texts sometimes included instructions for chants and instruments. In death, as in life, the journey was not silent. Music in Egypt served many masters, gods, kings, farmers, and mourners. but it always served a deeper truth. That sound was the language of the soul, and through it, even silence had meaning. In ancient Greece, music was more than art. It was mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and divination. It wasn't merely played, it was studied, theorized, worshipped. For the Greeks, music was a mirror of the cosmos, harmonious, ordered, and deeply sacred. The Greek word music didn't refer to music alone. It encompassed the entire domain of the muses, the goddesses of inspiration for poetry, dance, and song. To engage in music was to draw directly from divine influence. And so, from the street performers of Athens to the philosophers of Ionia, music was both a daily habit and a metaphysical pursuit. Instruments were everywhere. The lyre, a stringed instrument associated with the god Apollo, was central to education. Greek boys, especially of aristocratic backgrounds, learned to play it as part of their formal training. The kithara, a larger and more ornate version of the lyre, was used in professional performances and religious festivals. And then there was the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with a sharp, penetrating tone, often used to accompany dramatic performances, rituals, and even military exercises. Music was tied intimately to the dramatic arts in Greek tragedy. Choruses didn't just chant, they sang. Entire plays were structured with lyrical meters, turning dialogue into a melodic unfolding of fate. Every step of Oedipus, every lament of Medea, was underscored by rhythm and melody. But behind the performance lay theory. Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, was among the first to propose that music could be understood numerically. He observed that harmonious notes emerged from simple ratios like 2 to 1 or 3 to 2. From this, the concept of the music of the spheres was born, the idea that the planets themselves moved in cosmic harmony, producing a music too perfect for human ears to hear. Plato and Aristotle expanded on this. Plato believed music shaped the soul and therefore the state. The society's moral health could be gauged by its music. Certain scales and modes were uplifting, others dangerous. Music wasn't just expressive, it was formative. In Greece, to pluck a string was to brush the fabric of reality. To sing was to participate in divine order, and to understand music was to begin to understand the soul itself. When Rome absorbed the cultures around it, it didn't just take their land, it inherited their music. From Etruscan trumpets to Greek lyres, Roman music was a patchwork of styles and traditions woven together under one empire. But unlike the Greeks, who often philosophized about music's moral function, the Romans focused on its practical uses and sometimes its volume. Music in Rome was everywhere. In temples, military camps, theaters, banquets, and the infamous arenas, music served to command, entertain, and impress. One of the most iconic Roman instruments was the cornu, a large, curved brass horn used by the military. When blown, it sent clear signals across the battlefield, orders, formations, and alerts. It wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. For Roman soldiers, music was survival. In civilian life, the soundscape was more elaborate. The tibia, a Roman version of the Greek aulos. It was played at sacrifices and public events. The hydraulis, or water organ, was an early keyboard instrument that used air pressure and water to produce sound. Found in both religious ceremonies and gladiatorial games, it was likely loud, dramatic, and theatrical, perfectly suited for Rome's flair for spectacle. At banquets and private feasts, music took on a more seductive role. Women and enslaved performers often played stringed instruments like the cithara and lute, while dancers moved to soft rhythms. In elite Roman homes, music was a status symbol, an imported art from Greece or Egypt, made to dazzle guests and show refinement. But music also had spiritual roots. In Roman religion, certain ceremonies required specific chants and musical forms called carmen. These were sacred incantations believed to influence divine favor or ward off evil. Over time, some evolved into more structured hymns, blending spoken prayer with melody. What Rome lacked in originality, it made up for in adaptability. It absorbed music like it absorbed gods, rebranding, reshaping, and repurposing them to fit its needs. And as Roman roads carried legions across Europe, they also carried songs, instruments, and musical customs. Local tribes encountered not just soldiers, but the sound of empire. In Rome, music served many ends: glory, control, pleasure, and faith. It was the rhythm of the empire pulsing through marble halls and blood-stained sand, long before Vedic chants echoed through the temples of India. A quieter but equally profound musical culture thrived in the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's earliest urban societies. Though much about their music remains elusive, the fragments we've uncovered whisper of a people deeply attuned to rhythm, ritual, and sound. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley left behind no deciphered texts on music. Yet what they did leave their instruments, terracotta figurines, and urban acoustics speak volumes. Archaeologists have unearthed cylindrical drums, shell trumpets, and carved flutes made of bird bones and terracotta. Some of these flutes, remarkably, have perfectly spaced finger holes, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of pitch and scale. Perhaps most telling are the figurines of dancers found at sites like Mohenjo-Daro, limbs frozen mid-step, hair braided, torso swaying. Where there is dance, there is rhythm. Where there is rhythm, there is music. These figures suggest not only communal celebration, but choreographed, percussive culture. The drum wasn't just entertainment, it was expression. Later, as Vedic civilization emerged and Sanskrit texts began to form, the musical tradition of the Indian subcontinent would explode into complexity, but its seeds, those silent ceramic flutes of the Indus, had already taken root. Over time, music in India became inseparable from spiritual practice. The Vedas, the sacred Hindu texts, were chanted in highly regulated melodic patterns called sama. These weren't songs as we know them. They were sound formulas intended to maintain cosmic order. By the time of the Natya Shastra, an ancient treatise on drama, dance, and music, composed around 200 BCE, Indian music was already categorized into ragas, melodic modes, and talas, rhythmic cycles. Instruments like the veena, an early stringed instrument, and the mridangam, a double-headed drum, became staples of religious and court music. But even as theory deepened, the soul of Indian music remained the same. Music as devotion, music as vibration, music as a bridge between body and spirit, sound and silence, mortal and divine. In the lands of the Indus, music wasn't written in ink. It was written in breath, beat, and eternity. In ancient China, music was never merely sound. It was cosmic order made audible. Rooted in Confucian and Taoist philosophy, early Chinese music sought to mirror the harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. To play music was not just to entertain, but to align oneself with the moral and natural rhythms of the universe. Some of the oldest archaeological finds include stone chimes, bayanching, and bone flutes dating back to the Neolithic period. These instruments were carefully tuned not just for beauty, but to reflect cosmic principles. Each note was associated with one of the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, the seasons, and directions. A melody wasn't just music, it was philosophy and sound. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, 1046-2556 BCE, music had become a pillar of governance. Confucius himself famously said, "To educate someone, start with poetry, strengthen with ritual, and perfect with music." He believed that music shaped the soul and that a well-governed state would be reflected in its musical culture. Harsh or dissonant music meant disorder. Gentle, orderly tones signified harmony. Court musicians played with instruments like the guqin, a seven-string zither associated with scholars and sages. Its quiet, introspective tones weren't meant to entertain crowds, but to cultivate inner virtue. The players sat alone, fingers brushing the strings in a meditative dialogue between self and nature. Larger ensembles used instruments like the sheng, a mouth-blown free reed instrument, drums and bronze bells, especially in ancestral rites and state ceremonies. The iyu, or elegant music, was the official ceremonial genre used in rituals to honor heaven and ancestors. Every sound, every interval had a ritual function carefully controlled to avoid spiritual imbalance. Chinese music theory also developed unique scales, such as the pentatonic scale, which uses 5 notes per octave. This gave Chinese melodies their fluid, drifting quality, evoking water, wind, and introspection. In ancient China, to hear music was to hear the balance of the world. To perform it well was to live well. Every note was a prayer, every silence a teaching. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, music was a conduit between heaven and earth, between grief and praise, between people and their covenant with God. It wasn't entertainment. It was sacred. Every note played, every voice lifted was an offering. From the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible, music appears as a central force. In Genesis, Jubal is named as the father of all who play the lyre and pipe, suggesting that even at the very beginning, music was seen as a foundational human gift in Exodus. After the Red Sea parts and the Israelites escape Egypt, Miriam takes up a timbrel, leading women in dance and song, a moment of celebration carved forever into sacred memory. By the time of King David, music had become a structured, integral part of spiritual life. David himself was both warrior and musician, said to calm King Saul's tormented spirit with the sound of his harp. Under his reign, music flourished as a temple ritual. He appointed Levitical musicians whose role was not only to perform, but to preserve sacred songs and maintain spiritual order through sound. The Psalms, many attributed to David, form one of the oldest and richest hymnals in human history. These lyrical prayers, written in poetic form, were intended to be sung, chanted, or recited with instrumental accompaniment, usually lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets. Some psalms speak of sorrow, others of triumph, but all are musical expressions of the soul in dialogue with the divine. The first temple, built by Solomon, institutionalized music even further. Musicians were assigned shifts. Instruments were standardized. Trumpets signaled offerings. Cymbals marked sacred transitions. Music structured the calendar, framed the festivals, and deepened the meaning of every rite. Even after the temple's destruction, music lived on in memory and exile. In Babylon, the exiled Hebrews sang of Zion with trembling voices by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat and wept. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? Yet they sang. Hebrew music survived not by echoing through stone halls, but by being written on hearts. It was a music of resilience, born in covenant and carried across centuries in breath, bone, and prayer. As the ancient world slowly gave way to classical antiquity and the medieval age, the music of early civilizations did not vanish. It transformed. Its instruments were altered, its scales adapted, its traditions absorbed into newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems. But its essence endured the echo of a Mesopotamian lyre, the shimmer of an Egyptian sistrum, the silence between strokes on a Chinese guqin. These sounds did not die. They migrated, carried across time in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. In many ways, ancient music is a language we've forgotten how to fully speak but never stop listening for. We can't hear exactly how a Babylonian hymn sounded. We can only reconstruct it from clay tablets, fragmented notation, and ancient descriptions. But we can feel its intention, its effort to connect body and spirit, time and eternity. Even in the absence of full musical scores, we still see music etched in stone and painted on walls, dancing priestesses in Minoan frescoes, harpists carved into Assyrian reliefs, Roman mosaics showing cithara players at feasts. These images are static, yet they pulse with rhythm. They remind us that ancient music was never background noise. It was the heartbeat of ritual, the breath of ceremony, the fire of protest, and the balm of grief. And remarkably, some of it lives on. In India, the raga system still follows rules born from ancient Vedic chants. In China, guqin players still perform melodies that date back to Confucian temples. In Jewish synagogues, psalms are still chanted with traditional melodies that echo back thousands of years. These aren't recreations. They are continuations. Ancient music wasn't recorded in vinyl or digitized into streams. It was preserved in practice, in people, in purpose, passed down not through wires, but through witnessing. We may never hear a perfect reconstruction of an Inca festival song or a hymn sung in the court of UR. But when a hand drums a beat or a voice breaks into spontaneous song, or a melody lingers just long enough to bring tears, that is ancient. The civilizations may have crumbled, the empires may have fallen, but their music still plays, not in history books, but in the U.S. Pope John XII, the teen pope of sin. He was just 18 when he became the most powerful religious figure in the Western world, a boy crowned pope with no experience, no spiritual depth, and no intention of leading a holy life. John XII, born Octavianus, inherited the papacy in the year 955, thanks to the influence of his powerful father, Alberic II of Spoleto, who essentially installed his own son as pope while on his deathbed. But what followed was not a legacy of sacred devotion. It was a descent into scandal, violence, and unrestrained vice. John XII didn't see the papacy as a divine calling. He treated it as a toy. Roman historians from the time accused him of turning the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, into a brothel. Prostitutes were welcomed in holy chambers. Sacred relics were pawned off to fund his pleasures, and rather than preaching the Gospels. He was said to toast to pagan gods during drunken feasts and gamble with his bishops. And it wasn't just moral collapse, it was political chaos too. He angered many of his allies, especially the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. Their alliance crumbled after John XII secretly negotiated with Otto's enemies. In response, Otto marched on Rome and forced a synod to investigate the Pope. The accusations brought forward by bishops were staggering: simony, murder, incest, and invoking demons. He was deposed, but not for long. John XII returned to power with the help of Roman mobs and immediately took revenge. He mutilated his enemies, executed bishops who dared oppose him, and resumed his debauchery. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, his reign ended. In 964, the young pope died under mysterious circumstances, and fittingly scandalous circumstances. One account claims he died after being struck by a jealous husband who caught him in bed with his wife. Another simply says he suffered a stroke while committing adultery. Whatever the truth, Pope John XII teaches short life was one of recklessness, lust, and betrayal. He didn't just stain the papacy, he defiled it. In the long shadow of church history, few names echo with as much disgrace. Pope Benedict IX, the pope who sold his soul and the papacy. If John XII was the most depraved teenager to ever become pope, then Benedict IX was the most bizarre and arguably the most corrupt. He became pope not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum, Benedict IX first took the papal throne in the year 1032. He was likely no older than 20, placed there by his powerful and aristocratic family. But this was no boy of virtue. Chroniclers called his reign a disgrace, accusing him of rape, adultery, and even black magic. He was known to host wild orgies inside Vatican grounds, and was so hated that even the Roman people, used to political corruption, demanded his removal. But Benedict wasn't interested in reform. He was interested in pleasure. His first papacy ended when he was driven out by a rebellion. But he returned shortly after, then left again, then returned again. In a move that stunned even the most cynical observers of the time, Benedict IX decided to do something that would forever stain the reputation of the church. He sold the papacy. Yes, literally for gold. He approached his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, and offered him the papal seat for a price. Gratian, later known as Pope Gregory VI, accepted, though reportedly to bring peace to Rome. Still, the act was so scandalous that it set off a domino effect, plunging the church into a legitimacy crisis, and Benedict wasn't done. After selling the title, he changed his mind and tried to reclaim it twice. The church now had 3 men claiming to be pope at the same time. The situation grew so chaotic that Emperor Henry III had to step in, calling a council to resolve the mess. The result? All 3 were removed. Clean slate. Benedict IX was excommunicated not once, not twice, but multiple times over the years, depending on which faction held control. He's remembered not just as one of the worst popes, but as one of the most bizarre, greedy, and shameless. The man who treated the throne of St. Peter like a game of musical chairs, a pope for sale, a soul auctioned, and Rome would never forget it. Pope Alexander VI, the House of Borgia's crowned serpent. If there's one name that dominates every conversation about corruption in the Catholic Church, it's Borgia. Rodrigo Borgia, crowned as Pope Alexander VI in 1492, didn't just bring scandal to the papacy, he defined it. From the moment he assumed power, his reign was steeped in nepotism, bribery, and personal ambition. Alexander didn't rise through spiritual merit. He bought his way into the highest office in Christendom. The conclave that elected him was notorious for backroom deals and lavish bribes, and once he was enthroned, he wasted no time securing positions of wealth and power for his family. His papacy wasn't about shepherding souls. It was about expanding the Borgia dynasty. He openly acknowledged multiple children, including Cesare and Lucrezia, figures whose own reputations are soaked in legend, intrigue, and rumor. Cesare, a cardinal-turned-warrior, acted more like a mafia don than a church leader. Lucrezia was accused, perhaps unfairly, of incest, poisonings, and manipulating powerful men. But Alexander himself was no cleaner. He held lavish orgies inside the Vatican. One of the most infamous was the Banquet of Chestnuts, where 24 prostitutes were invited to entertain guests while the Pope allegedly watched from his throne. Dancers performed naked. Coins were tossed to see who could catch them with anything but their hands. Meanwhile, Alexander sold cardinalships to the highest bidder, regardless of merit. The church became a market and faith became a currency, yet strangely, he was also a skilled administrator. He strengthened the papal states, reformed certain bureaucracies, and even commissioned art, but none of that could wash away the filth that surrounded him. He died in 1503 under suspicious circumstances, some say poisoned by mistake while plotting to kill a rival. Even in death, the Borgia name lingered like incense clinging to a ruined chapel. He was buried with little ceremony. His body was so bloated from decay that it reportedly wouldn't fit into his coffin. To this day, Pope Alexander VI is remembered as the most scandalous pope in history. He didn't just defile the sanctity of the church, he weaponized it. Under his rule, the Vatican became a throne room of ambition, lust, and whispered deaths. Pope Stephen VI, the cadaver trial. Some papal scandals stained the church with greed, others with lust. But what Pope Stephen VI did was so macabre, so surreal, it bordered on the theatrical. It's remembered today as the Cadaver Synod, a trial unlike any other in history. The year was 897. Rome was in chaos, torn between rival factions, and Stephen VI, a pope placed in power by the powerful Spolitan family, wanted revenge on his predecessor, Pope Formosus. But there was one problem. Formosus was already dead, so Stephen had his decomposing corpse dug up from its tomb, dressed in full papal regalia, and dragged into the Lateran Basilica to stand trial. Yes, a dead pope seated on a throne, propped up by attendants, was placed on trial for alleged crimes. The charges? Perjury, violating canon law, and unlawfully ascending to the papacy. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse, answering Stephen's shouted accusations while the audience looked on, horrified. As the trial unfolded, the body slumped and swayed. Eventually, Pope Stephen VI declared Formosus guilty. The sentence? The corpse was stripped of its vestments, the papal fingers used for blessings were severed, and the body was thrown into the Tiber River. It was a grotesque spectacle, but also a deeply political move. By condemning Formosus, Stephen invalidated all the bishops and clergy he had ordained, clearing a path for his own supporters to rise. But the horror did not bring peace. The public was outraged. The Cadaver Synod triggered riots across Rome. Months later, Stephen was imprisoned. His enemies stormed his cell and strangled him to death in the aftermath. The church tried to bury the episode, both literally and figuratively. Formosus's body was recovered and reburied with honor. Future popes nullified the Cadaver Synod's rulings and forbade such trials from ever happening again. But the damage was done. Pope Stephen VI's legacy is not one of leadership, doctrine, or devotion. It is the image of a corpse on trial, a moment that turned the Vatican into a theater of the absurd. Even in death, the papacy was not safe from the wrath of politics. Pope Urban VI, the tyrant in white. While many corrupt popes masked their sins with charm or indulgence, Pope Urban VI made no such effort. His reign, beginning in 1378, was marked not by quiet scandal, but by open hostility, paranoia, and terrifying violence. Urban VI was elected during a time of tension, the cardinals, fearing Roman mobs, chose an Italian, Bartolomeo Prignano, hoping to calm the locals. But they soon regretted their decision. Urban turned out to be volatile, suspicious, and cruel. He rejected advice, berated his cardinals in public, and reportedly beat his staff for minor errors. He didn't just rule with an iron fist. He ruled with clenched teeth and a red face. His paranoia grew rapidly. He believed that his own cardinals were plotting against him, and instead of addressing their concerns, he responded with violence. When several cardinals conspired to oppose him, or perhaps just escape his wrath, he had them imprisoned, then tortured. Reports from the time describe their screams echoing through the Vatican walls. Some were brutally beaten, others slowly starved. 5 of them were executed without trial. Urban's instability led many to conclude that his election was invalid. A group of cardinals fled and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, based in Avignon. The result was one of the most damaging crises in church history, the Western Schism. For nearly 40 years, Europe was divided between 2 o'clock and sometimes even 3 competing popes. Different kingdoms backed different pontiffs, and beneath the surface, the unity of Christendom slowly fractured. Urban VI did not reconcile. He excommunicated his rivals and ruled with increasing isolation, surrounding himself with sycophants and brutes. As his mental health declined, so did the integrity of his reign. He alienated allies, destabilized Rome, and left the papacy stained with cruelty. He died in 1389, alone, bitter and reviled. Pope Urban VI's reign is often overshadowed by the schism that followed, but his own actions, his rage, his violence, and his thirst for domination were the spark that set the church ablaze. He wasn't just a bad pope, he was a tyrant cloaked in holiness, and his shadow still lingers in the pages of papal history. Pope Leo X, the prince who bankrupted salvation. When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, he wasn't stepping into a spiritual office. He was ascending a throne. Born into one of the richest families in Florence, Leo was a Renaissance prince long before he wore the papal tiara. And when he did, the Vatican became his playground. He once said, "God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it." And he did, extravagantly. Under Pope Leo X, the papal court ballooned into a theater of luxury. Gold dripped from ceilings, feasts never ended, and artists like Raphael filled the Vatican with beauty. He was a lover of poetry, pageantry, and performance. But beneath the surface of high culture lay financial ruin and spiritual disaster. Leo drained church coffers to fund his Renaissance ambitions, and when he ran out of money, he found a new way to raise funds by selling salvation. He authorized the sale of indulgences, certificates that, for a price, promised to reduce punishment for sins. Priests across Europe stood in churchyards, proclaiming as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It worked. Gold flowed into Rome, but outrage flowed faster. In 1517, a monk in Germany had enough. His name was Martin Luther, and he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, a direct protest against indulgences and papal corruption. How did Leo X respond? Not with humility or reform. He laughed it off, called Luther a drunken German who would change his mind when sober. When Luther didn't, Leo excommunicated him. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Reformation exploded. Churches broke away. The unity of Western Christendom shattered forever. To Leo, the church was a stage, and he was the star. But he couldn't see the cracks forming beneath his feet. He died in 1521, heavily in debt, unaware of the full fire he had lit. Pope Leo X is remembered less for the beauty he commissioned and more for the schism he helped cause, not through heresy or war, but through pride, excess, and a commodification of grace, a prince of the Medici, a performer on a sacred stage, and a pope who lost the soul of Europe. Pope Sergius III, the father of the pornocracy. Long before the age of bourgeois decadence or Renaissance indulgence, there was a pope who set a precedent for corruption that would echo through centuries. His name was Sergius III, and his reign in the early 10th century marked the beginning of what historians now call the pornocracy. Yes, the rule of harlots. Sergius III became pope in 904 after a bloody struggle in which his rivals were assassinated. It was an era where the papacy wasn't a divine office. It was a prize in a brutal Roman power game, and Sergius, ambitious and ruthless, was willing to kill for it. But it was his relationship with a noblewoman named Morozia that truly defined his papacy. Morozia belonged to the powerful Theophylact family, which essentially controlled Rome during this period. According to chroniclers, Sergius took her as his mistress while she was still a teenager. Their affair produced a child who would later ascend the papal throne himself as Pope John XI. Yes, you heard that correctly. A pope fathered another pope, the Roman clergy whispered. The public grumbled, but none dared challenge him. Sergius ruled with an iron hand, restoring the memory of Pope Formosus, the same corpse tried in the infamous Cadaver Synod, only to have him re-condemned, then buried again without honor. It was political vengeance disguised as papal authority. He filled the Curia with his supporters, sold church offices, and presided over what was arguably the most morally bankrupt period in papal history. While the Vatican should have been a beacon of spiritual leadership, it became a den of incestuous alliances and backdoor deals. The holiest office in Christendom had become a family business for Rome's elite. Under Sergius, the foundations of papal dignity cracked. He died in 911, still in power, still feared, but never revered. Pope Sergius III isn't as well known as the Borgias or the Medici popes, but his reign marked the beginning of nearly 60 years. Where the papacy was controlled by one Roman family through seduction, manipulation, and bloodline, he was the father of the pornocracy, a pope not just corrupted by power, but entwined in a legacy of lust and hereditary sin. Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who declared himself God on earth. When Pope Boniface VIII rose to power in 1294, he inherited a papacy in crisis. His predecessor had resigned, a rare and humble act. Boniface, however, was the opposite of humble. He saw the papal throne not as a burden of service, but as a throne of domination. He famously declared, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." But it was his bull Unum Sanctum that truly captured the scale of his ego. In it, Boniface claimed that submission to the Pope was absolutely necessary for salvation. He placed himself above kings, above emperors, above everyone. He believed that not only did he rule the Church, but all of Christendom. And he meant it. Boniface tried to exert control over European monarchs, especially Philip IV of France. But Philip wasn't just any king. He was shrewd, ruthless, and deeply resentful of papal overreach. When Boniface issued edicts interfering with French taxation of clergy, Philip responded with accusations, heresy, immorality, and even witchcraft. What followed was unprecedented. In 1303, a group of armed men, led by a French ally, stormed the papal residence in Anagni. They slapped the Pope across the face, a literal blow to papal authority. For 3 days, Boniface was held prisoner, humiliated by the very monarch he had tried to dominate. Though he was eventually freed, the damage was done. Boniface VIII died shortly after, either from illness or, as some say, rage and humiliation. But his downfall didn't stop there. Years later, his body was exhumed by enemies who claimed it reeked of sulfur, a symbolic gesture accusing him of damnation. And when Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy, he placed Boniface in the 8th circle of hell, the place reserved for corrupt churchmen. Pope Boniface VIII is remembered as the man who pushed papal arrogance to its breaking point. He saw himself as the ultimate ruler, but in trying to become a god among men, he nearly destroyed the respect for the papacy altogether. His story is a cautionary tale. When sacred power is wielded without humility, it becomes tyranny cloaked in divinity. Pope Innocent III, the crusader of blood and fire. Don't be fooled by the name. Pope Innocent III was anything but innocent. Crowned in 1198, he was one of the most powerful popes in history and one of the most dangerous. Unlike other corrupt pontiffs who indulged in personal pleasures, Innocent pursued power on a global scale. His weapon wasn't gold or women. It was a holy war. Under his rule, the papacy became an empire of swords. Innocent III launched the Fourth Crusade, a military campaign supposedly meant to retake the Holy Land, but it never even reached Jerusalem. Instead, in a shocking twist, the Crusaders turned on Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 1204, they sacked the city, looted churches, raped nuns, and stole relics in the name of God. This wasn't just a military disaster, it was a spiritual betrayal. Innocent claimed he was outraged, but by the time of his condemnation and reached the Crusaders, They had already declared victory and sent him spoils of war. But perhaps even darker was the Albigensian Crusade, a war he declared not in the Middle East, but within Europe itself. In southern France, the Cathars, a Christian sect labeled heretical, were spreading ideas that threatened the church's authority. Instead of sending theologians, Innocent sent knights. His message? Kill them all. God will sort them out. In 1209, the city of Béziers was attacked. When soldiers asked how to tell heretics from faithful Catholics, the response was chilling. Kill them all. Over 20,000 people were slaughtered, men, women, and children. Under Innocent III, the church declared war on its own people. Heresy was punished with extermination, and the seeds of the Inquisition were quietly planted during his reign. He died in 1216, satisfied with his campaigns and reforms. And while he did centralize church power and reshape canon law, his legacy is stained with the blood of those he labeled enemies, even if they wore the cross. Pope Innocent III didn't just rule the church, he weaponized it, and his crusades, launched under banners of purity and salvation, remain among the darkest blots on Christian history. Long ago, where the sands of Iraq now stretch silent and bare, there stood a city unlike any other Babylon, ancient, proud, and humming with life. It was a city of ziggurats and priests, of kings and scribes, of empires rising beneath stars that watched quietly from above. And at its heart, so the story goes, bloomed a garden that should not have been. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. A wonder they called it. A paradise not sprawled across fields but suspended in the air, layered in ascending terraces, each one bursting with color and life. Towering palms, fragrant myrrh, vines that curled and draped like green waterfalls. Water, the very essence of life, flowing through stone channels and trickling down walls. Feeding fruit trees that should never have thrived in that dry, blistering heat. To stand before it, they said, was like seeing a mountain made of gardens, a man-made Eden that rose up from the earth and challenged the very laws of nature. A miracle of engineering, a triumph of imagination, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But here is the question that haunts historians, archaeologists, and dreamers alike. Did it really exist? There are no Babylonian tablets that mention it, no inscriptions, no ruins. We can point to and say here it stood. All we have are the accounts of later Greek and Roman writers like Strabo and Philo of Byzantium, who described the gardens with awe, but from a distance of centuries. Could something so grand, so seemingly impossible, have simply vanished? Or worse, have never been there at all? And yet the legend endures. Perhaps it's because the story is too beautiful to let go. The idea that in a sun-scorched empire of dust and conquest, a king might build something purely for love, a garden for his homesick queen who longed for the green hills of her native land. That image has never left us. It lingers in poems, in paintings, in whispered hopes that somewhere beneath the ruins, roots still sleep in silence. The Hanging Gardens may be lost or never real, but the mystery is very much alive. To understand the gardens, we must first understand the city said to cradle them, Babylon. Situated along the Euphrates River in what is now modern-day Iraq, Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a statement. Massive walls wide enough for chariots to race atop towering temples, the famed Ishtar Gate glazed in deep blue and adorned with golden lions and dragons. Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia, the pride of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and at its center stood King Nebuchadnezzar II, the man most often credited with building the Hanging Gardens. He reigned in the 6th century BCE, a master builder and conqueror, who transformed the city into an architectural marvel. Under his rule, Babylon became a city of unprecedented scale, filled with temples, palaces, and ziggurats that reached skyward like mountains of mud, brick, and faith. But among the stone and ceremony, one story stands apart. A tale whispered by later Greek historians that Nebuchadnezzar had married a woman from the distant, forested land of Media, possibly Queen Amytis, and that she, homesick for the green hills of her childhood, found only flat desert and endless dust in Babylon. So the king built her a garden, not just a courtyard or a grove, but a structure so vast and intricate that it seemed to hang in the air, layered like the hills she missed, an offering of greenery in a land of fire, a gift of love wrapped in engineering. This version of the story is deeply romantic, almost too perfect, and yet it persists. Greek historians such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus described the gardens centuries later, writing of terraces stacked like steps to heaven, of irrigation systems lifting water from the river to the highest levels. They wrote with confidence, even though they had never seen the gardens themselves. So was this a real architectural marvel, or the ancient world's most enduring fairy tale? In a city as ambitious as Babylon, ruled by a king who reshaped landscapes, it's not hard to believe he might attempt such a feat. And perhaps in the cracks between myth and memory, there once bloomed something truly extraordinary, a dream made of stone, water, and longing. If the Hanging Gardens were real, they were more than a testament to beauty. They were a miracle of ancient engineering. Imagine trying to grow a mountaintop garden in the middle of a desert. Not just ground-level plants, but full-grown trees, shrubs, and flowering vines suspended over stone in blazing heat with little rainfall and no natural hills to build upon. To keep such a garden alive, the ancients would have needed more than green thumbs. They would have needed genius. Greek accounts give us clues. They describe terraces stacked like steps, built atop vaulted foundations made of baked brick and asphalt. The soil was layered thick, deep enough to root tall trees. But more astonishing than the architecture was the irrigation. How, in an age without modern pumps, could water be lifted from the Euphrates River to the uppermost levels of the garden? The answer may lie in a device known even then, the Archimedean screw, or a similar early water lifting mechanism, a spiraling tube housed in a cylinder turned by hand or foot, raising water upward through rotation. If the Babylonians had something like it, and there's reason to believe they did, it could have allowed for a continuous flow, feeding cascading streams that trickled from one level to the next. The system would have had to be maintained constantly, a living machine, not just an ornament. Channels carved through stone, gutters hidden beneath the foliage, workers tending to pipes as well as the plants, and all of it concealed beneath a blanket of leaves and blossoms, so that to the outsider, the garden appeared to breathe on its own. To the ancients who saw it, or who believed they did, it must have seemed like magic. A floating forest, a hill sculpted from water and will, something no other city could claim. But to today's archaeologists, it raises questions. Could such technology have existed in 6th century BCE Babylon? Or are we underestimating what ancient minds could achieve with enough ambition and a king's love? Perhaps that's what made the Hanging Gardens so wondrous. Not just their beauty, but the quiet message they carried that even in a desert, the impossible could grow as magnificent as the Hanging Gardens sound. There's a strange silence at the core of their story, a silence that has puzzled scholars for centuries. While later Greek and Roman writers spoke of them in vivid detail, Babylonian sources, the people who would have built and lived among these gardens, say nothing. There are no surviving tablets, no royal inscriptions, no temple records that describe such a garden. And this is odd, because the Babylonians were meticulous record keepers. They wrote about crops, taxes, gods, even the dimensions of buildings and the names of their architects. Yet nowhere do we find a single Babylonian line that confirms the existence of a massive terraced garden rising above their capital. Even King Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler most often credited with creating the gardens, left behind thousands of cuneiform inscriptions. He boasts of temples, walls, palaces, but never a word about a wonder made for his queen. No mention of terraces, no reference to an elevated Eden, and that silence matters. If the gardens had truly existed in the heart of Babylon, why would their creator omit them from the long list of his achievements? Why would scribes and priests, who detailed every corner of Babylonian religious life, ignore a garden said to rival paradise? Some argue that the gardens were destroyed early, vanishing long before Greek writers ever laid eyes on Babylon. Others suggest the gardens were not in Babylon at all, but somewhere else entirely misattributed by foreign historians trying to reconstruct the world from hearsay and fragments. One theory points to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, where the Assyrian king Sennacherib wrote of gardens watered by aqueducts and an elaborate water-raising device. Could the Greek authors have confused one Mesopotamian city for another? Or perhaps the gardens never existed, not physically. Perhaps they were always a symbol, a myth told and retold until it took on the weight of truth. A fantasy of paradise built in the mind of a faraway writer, meant to impress, to inspire, to astonish. But myths are never meaningless. Even in their silence, the Babylonians left us a puzzle, a space where wonder grows wild, fed not by fact, but by yearning, though Babylon's own records remain silent. The Greek historians spoke clearly and passionately. One of the most cited descriptions of the Hanging Gardens comes from Strabo, a geographer writing in the 1st century BCE. He never saw the gardens himself, but he passed along stories from earlier sources. Strabo described terraced platforms rising one above the other, supported by stone columns. He spoke of how water was drawn from the Euphrates using mechanical devices, perhaps the earliest reference to a water-lifting screw, and of a garden so large and elevated that it truly seemed to hang in the air. Another powerful account came from Diodorus Siculus, writing around the same time. He offered vivid detail: trees planted in deep layers of earth, stone walkways wide enough for chariots, and complex irrigation channels hidden beneath the greenery. He claimed that the gardens had been built by a king to comfort a queen. Both writers described a marvel beyond comprehension, a mountain made by human hands, a structure that defied the flat, dry landscape of Mesopotamia. And they weren't alone. Several Greek and Roman authors echoed similar tales. But here's the tension. These descriptions, though elaborate, were all secondhand. None of the authors had visited Babylon during the height of its splendor. Many were writing centuries after the supposed construction of the gardens. By then, Babylon was already fading, a crumbling memory on the edge of the known world. Were these accounts based on oral tradition, embellished travelers' tales, or were they distorted echoes of something once real, now swallowed by time? Still, these descriptions endured. For the Greeks, who revered order, beauty, and harmony with nature, the image of a lush, tiered paradise rising from the desert must have seemed like the perfect synthesis of human power and artistic vision. Whether real or exaggerated, the stories passed from scroll to scroll, century to century, until the Hanging Gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a title not easily earned and never forgotten. Sometimes we believe in things not because we can prove them, but because the world feels richer if they were true. If the Hanging Gardens weren't in Babylon, then where were they? One of the most compelling alternate theories comes not from denial, but from redirection. In the 20th century, a new voice emerged, that of Dr. Stephanie Dalley, a British Assyriologist who challenged the long-standing assumption that Babylon was the home of the Hanging Gardens. After decades of study, she proposed something radical. The gardens were real, but they were built in Nineveh, not Babylon. Nineveh, once the glittering capital of the Assyrian Empire, sat farther north along the Tigris River. Its great king Sennacherib ruled in the 7th century BCE, about a century before Nebuchadnezzar's time. And unlike Babylon, Sennacherib left behind records, clay tablets filled with pride and detail. In these inscriptions, he described a magnificent palace garden filled with exotic plants, fruit trees, and a massive aqueduct that brought water from the mountains 50 kilometers away. He even mentions a water-lifting screw, the same technology that Greek authors would later attribute to the Hanging Gardens. Could it be that what the Greeks described was based not on Babylonian glory, but on tales of Assyrian engineering? Misunderstood or misattributed across time, Daly also pointed out that the ancient word Babylon could mean more than one place. The Assyrians sometimes used it to refer to gateways of the gods, sacred cities, not just the city of Babylon itself. In this light, Nineveh may have been another Babylon, and the gardens, in fact, never moved at all. Only the name did. This theory doesn't erase the gardens. It relocates them. And in doing so, it brings clarity to the silence of Babylon and the boldness of Assyrian records. It suggests that the wonder was not imagined, just misunderstood. If true, it would mean the Hanging Gardens did exist, just not in the city we expected. It would make Sennacherib the creator, not Nebuchadnezzar, and it would rewrite one of the world's oldest architectural mysteries. Sometimes legends don't vanish. They simply shift places, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to read the ancient lines just a little differently. Beyond the bricks and aqueducts, beyond all the historical debates and archaeological theories, the story of the Hanging Gardens is also a love story, soft, persistent, and human. According to later tradition, King Nebuchadnezzar II did not build the gardens out of pride, nor as a temple, nor as a display of imperial power. He built them for Amytis, his queen, a woman far from home. Amytis was said to be a princess from Media, a land of rolling hills, cool breezes, and forests that whispered with green. When she married into the Babylonian court, she entered a world of heat and dust, endless flatlands, brown brick walls, and a sun that rarely relented. And so, the legend goes, the king saw her sadness and answered it with a garden. He ordered the creation of a mountain in the middle of the city, not one made of earth and stone alone, but one woven with vines, scattered with blossoms and breathing with water. He called on architects, engineers, and slaves to raise a monument not of conquest, but of comfort, a piece of her homeland sculpted in the very heart of his. This is not a confirmed fact. No Babylonian text records her name. No tablets speak of her sorrow, but the tale has echoed through time for a reason. Because it's easy to imagine, easy to believe that in the center of one of the world's greatest cities, the king once tried to make a single soul feel less alone. And perhaps that's what gives the Hanging Gardens their enduring power. Not just that they were beautiful, not just that they defied gravity, but that they were born, at least in story, from devotion. Not to a god, but to a woman. In that version of the tale, the garden becomes more than architecture. It becomes a quiet rebellion. In a world shaped by war and empire, someone built something not to dominate, but to heal. Stone by stone, leaf by leaf, drop by drop. Even if the gardens never existed, the love that built them still does. If the Hanging Gardens were once real, where did they go? Great wonders often fall not with a crash, but with a whisper, slowly, quietly, over generations. Time doesn't just erase buildings, it buries them in silence. And Babylon, once the jewel of Mesopotamia, was no exception. The city endured centuries of conquest and decay. After the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, it passed into the hands of the Persians. Then the Greeks, then the Parthians. Each ruler left a mark, but none maintained the splendor that Nebuchadnezzar had built. Babylon's bricks were torn down to construct new cities. Earthquakes and erosion took their toll. Sand swept in from the desert, burying gardens and gates alike. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in the 4th century BCE, Babylon was a fading echo. He dreamed of restoring it, even making it the capital of his empire. But death claimed him before the dream could take shape. Without a patron, the city was left to rot. No one knows exactly when the gardens vanished. Perhaps they were dismantled. Perhaps they collapsed from neglect. Or perhaps they never stood at all, existing only in the pages of foreign writers who had heard a story too good to question in the 19th and 20th centuries. Archaeologists uncovered the foundations of Babylon's grand ziggurats and palaces, but no trace of the gardens has ever been definitively found. The absence is heavy. It lingers like the space where a great tree once stood, roots gone, but the shape of its shade still remembered. Even if they once towered in reality, the Hanging Gardens have now passed into a different kind of truth, the truth of memory, myth, and longing. We searched the ruins not just for brick or pipe, but for proof that such wonder was possible. That humanity, even in its earliest days, dreamed of beauty that reached upward. And maybe that's what makes their disappearance so haunting. Not that they vanished, but that they may have never existed at all. And yet we still believe, because the mind, like the desert, is a place where forgotten things can still bloom. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, real or imagined, occupy a rare space in human history. We have no stones, no carvings, no ruins to stand before, and yet they remain one of the most vivid and beloved wonders of the ancient world. Why? Because some wonders live not in earth and mortar, but in the imagination. The idea of a garden reaching into the sky, blooming above a parched desert, fed by clever machines and crowned with cascading greenery, it speaks to something deeper than history. It taps into our longing to create beauty where it should not exist, to tame nature, to build joy from barren stone. Whether raised by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon or by Sennacherib in Nineveh, or simply dreamed into being by Greek poets and travelers, the gardens remind us of what ancient people were capable of and what they hoped for. In a world of conquest, someone dreamed of green. In a land of walls and war, someone imagined waterfalls and flowers. And isn't that enough? Even now, artists paint it. Writers write it. Engineers puzzle over it. Filmmakers render it in vivid digital forms, a place no one alive has seen. And yet, we all feel as if we have. We can picture it. The damp stone beneath bare feet, the scent of jasmine in the wind, the splash of water echoing through terraces. A garden not made to be conquered, but to be remembered. It's the possibility of the Hanging Gardens that makes them eternal. We dig for ruins and debate ancient texts because we want them to be real. But maybe the truth is they already are. Not in Mesopotamian soil, but in the collective memory of humanity. A shared vision passed from hand to hand, mind to mind, for more than 2,000 years, and in that way they have never disappeared. They hang still, not above Babylon, but above us all, suspended in time, blooming in silence, rooted in wonder, and sometimes late at night, when the world grows quiet. We remember even in the hottest deserts of history, something green once grew. Before coins jingled in pockets and bills changed hands at markets, there was a time when humanity had no money. Yet trade still flourished. It was a world of barter, where goods and services were exchanged directly. A farmer with a surplus of grain might trade it for fish from a nearby river. A skilled potter could swap bowls and jugs for woven cloth. It was a system built on mutual need, but bartering had its limits. Imagine this. You're a shepherd with 3 goats and you want salt. You find someone with salt, but they have no need for goats. The deal falls apart. This is known as the coincidence of wants, the challenge of finding someone who both has what you want and wants what you have. In small villages where everyone knew one another, this was manageable. But as communities grew into cities and cities into kingdoms, bartering became clumsy, slow, and impractical. The next step was to find something that could stand in for value, something that could be agreed upon by everyone, durable, portable, and ideally scarce. Early societies began to lean on objects that were easy to measure and hard to fake. Sometimes that meant using livestock. A goat might be worth 2 chickens or 10 measures of grain. In other cultures, it meant salt. In fact, the word salary comes from salarium, the Latin term for the salt rations paid to Roman soldiers. Other societies turned to tools and weapons, polished axe heads in the Stone Age or bronze blades in ancient China, not necessarily to be used, but because they held clear value and could be exchanged. These were not yet money in the form we know today, but they were a bridge between barter and currency. They allowed people to assign abstract value to physical goods, and more importantly, they introduced the idea of value being stored and passed along. Before coins, before numbers stamped on silver discs, there was a far more ancient truth. People have always needed ways to trust each other in trade, and currency in its earliest form was simply a promise carved not in paper or metal, but in human need. As human societies expanded and bartering grew too complex, a quiet transformation began. Communities started to adopt objects of agreed value, not because they were useful, but because everyone agreed they were valuable. This was the birth of proto-currency, the first stepping stones toward money as we know it. One of the earliest and most widespread forms was the cowrie shell. Small, smooth, and pearly white, these shells came from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They were naturally beautiful, hard to counterfeit, and easy to carry. Cowries began to appear across vast regions, from Africa to China, used in trade, tribute, and even dowries. In some African kingdoms, large bags of cowries were stored in royal treasuries like modern bank vaults in ancient China. Bronze imitations of cowries were cast and circulated like coins, but cowries weren't alone. In ancient Mesopotamia, people used measured silver, not coins, but weighed lumps for trade. Merchants carried scales to weigh silver in shekels, and contracts recorded exact amounts. Silver had no standard shape or stamp yet, but it held value, especially in urban economies where accounting was key. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs used cacao beans as currency. These weren't just used to make chocolate. They were counted, stored, and protected like money. 10 beans might buy a rabbit. 100 could fetch a small woven cloak. In the Philippines, gold rings and bars called pilancitos were used in markets centuries before colonial influence. In some parts of Africa, iron tools such as hoes or spears were accepted in trade, not for their use, but for their consistent value. What connected all these systems was the shift in thinking. Value didn't need to be immediate or personal. It could be symbolic. A small shell or shiny metal could represent something larger, time, labor, or security. These early forms of currency changed how people interacted now. One didn't have to trade directly for a needed good. You could accept something of value today and use it later for something else entirely. Trust began to flow through tokens, objects, and numbers. Money was no longer about survival. It had become a language, spoken in cowries, beans, and bars of silver. As trade networks expanded and civilizations grew, so too did the need for more reliable and standardized forms of money. Trusting in cacao beans, cowries, or weighed silver worked, but only up to a point. What societies needed next was uniformity, money that didn't just represent value but carried an authority behind it. This led to one of the most significant shifts in economic history, the rise of metal as money. Metals like gold, silver, copper, and bronze had already been used in trade for centuries. They were rare, durable, and could be melted and reshaped without losing value. But their use was still inconsistent. A piece of silver in one region might be accepted, but in another it would need to be tested, weighed, and judged all over again. So ancient cultures began shaping metal into consistent forms: bars, rings, and eventually coins. The key wasn't just the shape, it was the guarantee. Some of the earliest known coins came from the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, around 600 BCE. These coins were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and stamped with images. Lions, for example, as a mark of authenticity from the Lydian king. Now the value wasn't just in the metal, it was in the seal. Stamped metal became a revolutionary idea. A coin meant something. It had weight, yes, but it also had the backing of a ruler, a state, or an empire. A person could accept a coin not just because it was shiny and heavy, but because they trusted that everyone else would accept it too. Soon the idea spread. Greek city-states, the Persian Empire, Rome, India, and China all developed their own coinage systems. Each coin was a symbol of control, communication, and commerce. Kings and emperors printed their faces onto currency, not just for recognition, but for power. Every exchange carried their image, their name, their reach. In these stamped metals, money evolved. It became not just a means of trade, but a message. A message that said this has value because we say it does, and because you believe it. The idea of money truly changed the moment it became minted. Not just shaped metal, but officially authorized currency stamped by a ruling power. This wasn't just innovation, it was a declaration. As early as the 7th century BCE, the Lydians in Anatolia began producing coins made of electrum, a naturally occurring blend of gold and silver. These weren't decorative tokens. They were created for trade, each stamped with a lion's head, the royal emblem of King Alyattes. These first coins didn't bear numbers. Instead, their weight and the authority of the stamp confirmed their worth. The practice caught on quickly. In nearby Greece, city-states began minting their own coins using symbols of local identity. Owls for Athens, turtles for Aegina, Pegasus for Corinth. Each coin reflected pride, culture, and trust. Greek coins were not just currency. They were miniature pieces of propaganda carried from one market to another. Over time, rulers discovered something else. Control over money meant control over people. If a king could decide what counted as money, he could influence trade, raise armies, and shape the economy of an entire region. In Persia, King Darius the First introduced a gold coin called the daric, stamped with an image of the king himself holding a bow. It circulated across a vast empire, connecting lands from Egypt to India with one consistent form of money. Meanwhile, in China, early coins took on distinctive shapes: spades, knives, and round discs with square holes in the center. Cast in bronze and bearing the marks of dynasties, these coins were strung together on ropes and worn like wallets around the waist. Their form reflected both utility and symbolism. Square representing the earth and the circle heaven. The act of minting money transformed how people experience value. Coins became trusted tools not just for local trade, but for long-distance exchange. Soldiers were paid in them, taxes were collected through them, markets grew around them, and with every stamped image, be it a god, a king, or a mythical beast, money whispered the same message. This is more than metal. This is power. This is the law. This is the order. Currency was no longer born of barter. It was born of command. As currency systems spread across the ancient world, no civilization refined, expanded, and standardized coinage like the Romans. For them, money wasn't just about trade. It was about the empire by the time of the Roman Republic. Coins had become essential to everyday life. The Romans introduced a system based on bronze and silver, later adding gold as the empire grew wealthier. Their earliest coin, the AS rood, was simply a chunk of bronze. But over time, they began producing carefully weighed and stamped coins, each with a specific role in the economy and a story to tell. The denarius is minted in silver. It became one of the most famous Roman coins. It was used for military salaries, civic payments, and trade across the empire. On one side, a Roman symbol, a god, figure of victory, or a scene of conquest. On the other side, the face of the emperor. In this way, coins became political tools. Every transaction was also a moment of propaganda, the emperor's image placed directly into the hands of his people. It reminded them who ruled, even when they were simply buying bread or paying a tax. But Roman currency wasn't just powerful, it was complex. The empire used different metals, values, and mints scattered across regions. As Rome expanded, it absorbed the monetary systems of other cultures, reissuing local currencies under Roman authority. This brought consistency and order to trade from Britain to Judea. However, even empires can struggle with money. As the Roman economy faced military pressure and internal corruption, the state began debasing its currency, mixing less precious metal into silver and gold coins. Over time, the denarius lost its shine and its value. Inflation soared. Trust in money declined. Still, the system endured for centuries. Roman coins traveled farther than Roman legions. Showing up as far away as India and Scandinavia, they weren't just instruments of commerce, but symbols of Roman influence, carried in pockets, buried in hoards, lost in riverbeds. And when the empire fell, the coins remained artifacts of a civilization that understood one simple truth. If you can't control the coin, you can shape the world it flows through. While Rome was forging its empire through minted silver and bronze, the ancient civilizations of Asia were building their own rich histories of currency, often just as innovative and in some ways far more enduring. In China, the evolution of money took a unique path. Early forms weren't round. They were shaped like tools: spade money, knife money, and later bell-shaped coins. These reflected practical symbols of value, agriculture, and labor. But as the need for standardized trade grew, the Chinese began producing round coins with square holes in the center. These could be strung together on cords, 1,000 coins tied in a loop, carried on a belt, or hidden in walls for safekeeping. The square hole wasn't just functional, it held cosmic symbolism. Round represented heaven, and the square symbolized earth, uniting the two in every transaction. These coins were typically made of bronze, and marked with inscriptions declaring their origin, often tied to the emperor or the dynastic era. But unlike in Rome, where coins constantly changed with each new ruler, Chinese coinage stayed remarkably consistent in shape and style across centuries. In this continuity, there was stability. Further south and west, India developed its own early currency system as far back as the 6th century BCE. Small silver pieces called punch-marked coins were in circulation. They were irregular in shape, stamped with symbols like suns, elephants, or hills, not faces. These coins spoke of nature, religion, and power in a land where trade connected silk routes to seaports. Meanwhile, the vast network known as the Silk Road stretched across Asia, linking China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Along it flowed silk, spices, porcelain, and money. Coins of Chinese emperors, Roman Caesars, and Persian kings all passed hand to hand, crossing deserts and mountains carried by merchants, monks, and caravans. In the East, currency wasn't just about spending, it was about philosophy, stability, and identity. Coins became part of rituals, of offerings, of ancestral worship. Some were never meant to be used, only buried, burned, or gifted. And while empires rose and fell, the coins remained quiet messengers from the past, whispering across centuries in the language of value. By the time metal coins had been circulating for over 1,000 years, another revolution was quietly unfolding, not in the West, but in China, there among merchants, scholars, and dynasties. A new idea began to take root. Money didn't have to be heavy. It could be written. The first known use of paper money dates back to the Tang dynasty around the 7th century CE. Initially, it wasn't official currency, just promissory notes issued by wealthy merchants and trusted lenders. Travelers across long distances found it easier to carry paper receipts than bags of bulky coins. The idea was simple. Instead of hauling silver, you carried a note promising payment in silver, backed by a reliable source. It wasn't long before the government took notice. By the 11th century, During the Song Dynasty, China began issuing the world's first government-backed paper currency, known as jiaozi. These notes were printed with official seals, expiration dates, and intricate patterns to prevent counterfeiting. They were lighter, easier to transport, and incredibly efficient for large-scale trade. This invention came centuries before paper money appeared anywhere else in the world. While Europe still clinked with metal, China was trading with slips of ink-stamped mulberry bark. But paper money brought new risks. Coins had intrinsic value. They were made of metal that could be melted or repurposed. Paper, on the other hand, was only valuable because the government said it was. This required an entirely new kind of trust. Not in gold, but in the promise behind the paper. Inflation became a danger. In times of political instability or overprinting, the value of paper could plummet. Still, the innovation stuck. The Yuan dynasty, under Mongol rule, expanded the use of paper money across their vast empire, even issuing notes in multiple languages. When Marco Polo arrived in China in the 13th century, he was stunned. He described the system in awe, noting that Kublai Khan's paper notes held power equal to the coin of the realm. To the European mind, it was alchemy, turning paper into gold. But the Chinese had simply realized something profound. Money was no longer a thing. It was a belief, a shared trust, printed, sealed, and carried like a whisper across continents. As trade routes stretched across continents and economies grew more complex, carrying coins or even paper notes became risky and inefficient. Merchants needed a way to store value safely and move wealth without hauling heavy sacks of silver. And so, out of necessity, emerged one of the most transformative inventions in the history of money, the bank. The earliest banking systems appeared in the ancient world, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. But it was during the medieval period, particularly in the Islamic world and Renaissance Italy, that banking became institutionalized. In bustling cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and later Venice and Florence, wealthy merchant families began offering credit, loans, and deposit services. A trader in Cairo could deposit gold with a banker, receive a written note of credit, and then redeem it weeks later in Damascus, a system remarkably similar to modern checks. The most powerful of these institutions were not kings or priests, but families like the Medici, who financed voyages, wars, and empires. They didn't just store money. They moved it, multiplied it, and controlled it. At the core of this new system was a radical idea. Money did not need to exist physically at all times. You could have a promise, a ledger entry, and that alone could be traded, borrowed against, or invested. With that came the concept of credit, the trust that someone would repay their debt in the future. Entire networks of trade began operating not on coins, but on confidence. Banks issued letters of credit, notes, and eventually began creating money through lending. This shift transformed economies. Wealth could now move faster than caravans. Fortunes could be made not just by mining gold, but by lending it. A merchant's influence no longer depended on what he carried, but on what he was owed. Of course, with credit came risk. Defaults, fraud, and economic bubbles all grew in this new world of invisible wealth. But there was no turning back. Money had evolved once again, from object to symbol, and now to record, from copper coins to ink on paper, from silver in hand to trust in a ledger. Currency was no longer just held. It was believed into being. Today, when you tap your phone to pay for coffee or transfer money across the globe with a click, you're engaging in a transaction that doesn't involve a single physical coin or bill. No metal, no paper, just numbers on a screen. And yet the trade is real. The goods are exchanged. The system holds. We've entered the era of invisible money. From the shells and silver of ancient times, currency has now become code. Digital banking, online payments, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currencies are transforming what it means to own, store, and spend money. And for many, the idea of cash is slowly fading into memory with a digital bank account. You no longer hold money. You access it. Your balance lives on a server, updated in real time, managed by systems you'll never see. Money now moves at the speed of light, crossing borders, buying stocks, funding startups with zero physical form. And then there's cryptocurrency, a bold experiment in trust without authority. No king, no central bank, just blockchain, a decentralized ledger. Verified by thousands of independent nodes, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others don't exist in vaults. They exist only as math, and yet they're traded, stored, and even used to buy homes, cars, and art. We've come a long way from goats and grain, and yet the essence of money has never changed. Whether stamped in bronze, printed in ink, or rendered in lines of code, money is still built on the same ancient foundation: trust. The belief that this object or screen or string of numbers can be exchanged for something you want. It's a social contract whispered across time from barter to blockchain. The future of money may be cashless, contactless, and entirely digital, but its roots stretch backward into clay tablets, silver scales, and gardens of cowrie shells. And no matter how modern it becomes, money will always be a story, told not just in numbers, but in the ancient human need to trade, to trust, and to believe in value where none exists. In the golden haze of Greek legend, no figure shines brighter or casts a longer shadow than Helen of Troy. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born not of a woman, but from an egg. Her beauty, poets claimed, was unmatched, so powerful, so divine. Those men went to war over her. Entire kingdoms bled for her name. Helen was queen of Sparta, married to King Menelaus when Paris, a young Trojan prince, arrived. Some say he stole her. Others say she followed willingly. Either way, when the sails of his ship disappeared over the horizon, the ancient world tilted into chaos. Menelaus, humiliated and furious, called upon the oath all of Helen's former suitors had sworn, the vow to protect her marriage, no matter who won her hand. And so, under the banner of honor and vengeance, Greece united. Kings gathered their ships, among them Agamemnon, the ambitious high king of Mycenae, Odysseus, the clever strategist of Ithaca, and Achilles, the half-divine warrior whose name would become legend. They sailed for Troy, a city said to be wealthy, fortified, and proud. For 10 years they fought beneath its towering walls. Battles raged, heroes died, and gods took sides. Zeus and Hera, Apollo and Athena all turned the war into a divine spectacle. The death of Patroclus, the rage of Achilles, the slaying of Hector, and finally the trick of the wooden horse. That is the myth, a sweeping epic of passion, pride, and betrayal. But what of reality for centuries? Historians believed it was fiction, a beautiful lie told by poets like Homer, who wrote the Iliad centuries after the war supposedly occurred. Yet buried beneath the legend is something stubborn, something real. The city of Troy was not a fantasy. It existed, and in the late 19th century, a German archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann claimed to have found it. Layers of ruins buried beneath a hill in modern-day Turkey. So now the question is no longer, did Troy exist? Did a war happen there? And was there ever really a Helen, a Paris, and Achilles? To find the truth, we must peel back the poetry and dig into the dust of the Bronze Age. Centuries after the supposed fall of Troy, a blind poet named Homer shaped the war into legend. His epic, the Iliad, composed around the 8th century BCE, became the cornerstone of Greek identity, a story of gods, rage, and doomed heroes. But Homer wasn't writing history. He was preserving memory, shaped, stretched, and sung by generations of storytellers before him. The Iliad doesn't begin with the abduction of Helen. It begins with Achilles' anger, months into the war. Gods walk the battlefield. Heroes duel in single combat. The Greeks are not simply warriors. They are almost mythic beings, larger than life, yet achingly human in their pride, grief, and glory. Homer never claims to have seen these events. He lived nearly 500 years after the war would have taken place. Yet his knowledge of Bronze Age weapons, armor, and customs is striking, far too accurate to be coincidence. Scholars believe Homer may have drawn from oral traditions passed down over centuries, preserving echoes of real conflicts in poetic form. But it's not just the Iliad. Homer's Odyssey follows the aftermath, the long journey home. Other works, now lost or fragmented, told of Achilles' death, the fall of Troy, the Trojan horse, and the sack of the city. Together, these tales formed what was known as the epic cycle. To the ancient Greeks, these weren't fairy tales. They were ancestral memories, a record of a heroic age when gods mingled with men and the fate of nations turned on the honor of a single warrior. The Trojan War became a cultural anchor. Every city-state wanted a piece of it. Kings claimed descent from its heroes. Poets retold the story again and again. But was Homer describing history? Or had centuries of storytelling transformed a local skirmish into a cosmic tragedy? That's the mystery. And it leads us to a quiet hill in modern-day Turkey, where stone, ash, and buried walls may still hold a sliver of the truth. Because sometimes the line between myth and memory is as thin as a poet's breath. For centuries, Troy was believed to be a myth, a fabled city born from Homer's imagination, but in the late 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann set out to prove otherwise. Driven more by passion than formal training, Schliemann believed the stories were rooted in truth. Guided by Homer's texts, he identified a mound in northwestern Turkey known as Isalik. To the casual eye, it was just a hill. But beneath its surface, layer by layer, lay the buried remains of ancient cities. Not just one Troy, but several. Schliemann began to excavate with urgency and at times recklessness. He dug deep past Roman and Hellenistic ruins until he reached what he believed was the true Troy. There he claimed to discover Priam's treasure, a collection of gold jewelry and artifacts which he dramatically declared belonged to the king of Troy himself. He even adorned his wife in them for a photograph, a romantic but highly controversial move. Modern archaeologists later found that Schliemann had dug too deep. The layer he identified dated back to around 2500 BCE, far too early to be the Troy of Homer. But above it, in layers 6 and 7, were cities from the late Bronze Age, around 1300 to 1200 BCE, precisely the era when the Trojan War was said to have occurred. These layers revealed fortified walls, large towers, and signs of destruction by fire. In layer 7, archaeologists found evidence of arrowheads, slingshots, and collapsed buildings, signs of siege or warfare. Could this have been a city that faced the wrath of Mycenaean Greece? Not all scholars agree. Some suggest the destruction was due to an earthquake or a civil conflict rather than an invading army. Others argue the war, if real, was a smaller conflict later expanded into legend. Still, the city at Isalik is now widely accepted as the historical Troy, a powerful settlement that controlled trade routes between the Aegean and the East, a city worth fighting for. So perhaps the war was real, perhaps not as Homer told it, but real enough to inspire 3,000 years of story. And that in itself is a kind of truth. While Troy may have been real, no war could exist without an opposing force in Homer's story. That force was the mighty coalition of Greek kings. But in historical terms, they would have come from the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans were the dominant power of mainland Greece during the late Bronze Age, from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. They left behind massive palaces, written records, and rich tombs filled with weapons, gold, and art. The most famous of these palaces sat atop a hill in Mycenae, the supposed seat of King Agamemnon, the man who led the Greek forces to Troy. Unlike Homer's tales of honor and fate, Mycenaean society was pragmatic and militaristic. Their palaces were built like fortresses. Their warriors were buried with armor and swords. Their art depicted war chariots, sieges, and soldiers in formation. These were not the loose confederations of later classical Greece. They were centralized kingdoms, run by powerful rulers and an administrative elite, and they weren't isolated. Mycenaean pottery has been found across the eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt, the Levant, and yes, even near Troy. They were traders and seafarers, but also raiders and conquerors. They likely competed for influence and control of coastal cities and key trade routes, especially in western Anatolia, where Troy stood in Linear B. Their early script. We even see signs of a military culture that demanded tribute, recorded taxes, and listed detailed inventories of arms and armor. Though the script offers no mention of a Trojan War, it reveals a world where such a conflict wouldn't have been unusual. So what if the war wasn't over Helen at all? What if it was about control of trade, of sea lanes, of influence in the East? A real Mycenaean expedition against a rich rival city like Troy wouldn't need gods and romance to justify it. All it would take was power, ambition, and timing. Perhaps the Greeks did sail across the Aegean. Perhaps they laid siege to a city with high walls. And perhaps that story was passed from mouth to mouth, growing with each retelling until it sang of heroes to understand the Trojan War. We must step into the minds of the people who told it and believed it. The Greeks of the archaic and classical periods didn't separate myth from history the way we do today. To them, the stories of Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Helen weren't just entertainment. They were echoes of a heroic past, a golden age when gods walked among men and fate was etched into stone by divine hands. In the Iliad, the gods don't merely observe the war. They participate. Aphrodite protects Paris. Athena guides Achilles. Zeus balances the scales of fate. This divine intervention wasn't a literary device. It was a worldview. The gods were seen as real forces, emotional, unpredictable, and deeply entwined with human affairs. Yet beneath the gods and prophecies are human stories of rage, pride, vengeance, and grief. Achilles isn't just a warrior. He's a young man wrestling with loss and the cost of glory. Hector isn't merely Troy's champion. He's a father and husband who knows he's fighting a war he cannot win. These characters feel alive precisely because their struggles are timeless. So where do these figures fall on the spectrum between history and myth? There's no archaeological evidence for Achilles or Helen, no records of a king named Priam or a prince named Paris. But some names, like Alexandros, another name for Paris, do appear in ancient Anatolian texts, and the concept of warrior chiefs, feuding kings, and shifting alliances certainly fits the late Bronze Age world. What seems likely is this. The war, if real, was fought by people who would have looked very different from Homer's heroes, less like demigods in gleaming bronze and more like gritty warlords fighting for territory tribute or revenge. But over time, the memory of their struggle became something more. It was told and retold not just to preserve fact, but to shape identity. For the Greeks, the Trojan War became a mirror, reflecting their values, fears, and dreams. In that way, myth does something history can't. It feels true even when it isn't, and that is why it endures. If there is one moment from the Trojan War that echoes louder than all others, it is this, the fall of Troy. In the heart of it lies the most famous trick in Western storytelling, the Trojan horse. According to Homer's later commentators, and told most fully in Virgil's Aeneid, the Greeks, unable to breach Troy's mighty walls after 10 long years, devised a cunning ruse. They pretended to sail away, leaving behind a giant wooden horse as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, weary from war and eager to believe it was over, brought the horse inside the city gates as a trophy. That night, as the city slept, Greek soldiers hidden within the horse emerged, opened the gates, and let in the returning Greek army. Troy was sacked, its temples burned, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Priam, the king, was cut down, and the once mighty city was reduced to rubble, the tragic end to a proud civilization. But did it happen? Archaeology shows that Troy 7, one of the layers uncovered at Hizarlik, was indeed violently destroyed around 1180 BCE. Charred remains, broken walls, and a sudden end to habitation all suggest catastrophe. It fits the timeline. It fits the legend, yet there is no physical trace of a giant wooden horse, no records of a deception that clever. It may have been a poetic invention, a metaphor for betrayal, or a dramatic flourish added by later poets to give the story its unforgettable climax. Some scholars suggest the horse could have been a misunderstood siege engine, or even a forgotten term for an earthquake or internal revolt. Others believe it never existed at all, that it was a story crafted for symbolic power rather than factual truth. But whether myth or metaphor, the fall of Troy represents something more, the collapse of a world. In the decades following Troy's destruction, many great Bronze Age cities, from Mycenae to Ugarit, also fell. Trade routes broke down, languages vanished, civilizations crumbled. The Trojan War may have been the last great chapter of a fading age, and the horse, whether real or imagined, became the door through which that ancient world stepped into legend. The fall of Troy didn't end the story. In fact, for many ancient audiences, it was just the beginning. The aftermath of the war echoed through the ancient world like a long, sorrowful chord. Homer's Odyssey follows Odysseus, who wandered for 10 years after the war, facing monsters, witches, and the wrath of Poseidon. His journey became a tale of endurance, longing, and the cost of victory. Other heroes met darker fates. Agamemnon, the great king who led the Greeks, was murdered by his wife upon returning home. Ajax took his own life after being dishonored. Menelaus returned to Sparta with Helen, but their reunion, according to some accounts, it was cold and distant. And then there was Aeneas, a Trojan prince who, according to Roman mythology, escaped the burning city with his father and young son. His journey, told by the Roman poet Virgil in the Aeneid, took him across the Mediterranean through storms and battles until he arrived in Italy. There he was said to be the forefather of Rome itself. This wasn't just a story, it was political mythology. By claiming descent from the Trojans, the Romans tied their empire to the Age of Heroes, suggesting their civilization rose not from barbarians, but from survivors of a sacred past. In this way, the Trojan War became more than a Greek legend. It became a pan-Mediterranean memory. Every culture wanted a connection to Troy, whether as victors, victims, or inheritors. Cities claimed Trojan founders. Kings boasted of Trojan blood. But what does this tell us about the reality of the war? Perhaps that it mattered far more than just the fighting. Troy, real or not, became a symbol of endurance, of loss, of the rise and fall of nations. And in that symbol, civilizations found meaning, roots, and legitimacy. For the ancient world, Troy wasn't just a city, it was a turning point, a mythic fracture between what was and what would be. And from its ashes rose stories of survival, sorrow, and new beginnings. As centuries passed, the story of the Trojan War was no longer just a tale told by bards. It became a tool. Myth turned into memory, and memory into power. In classical Greece, cities like Athens and Sparta used the Trojan War to define themselves. Athenian playwrights reimagined Helen and Menelaus, not as mere victims or lovers, but as symbols of Greek pride, honor, and sometimes failure. Euripides questioned the morality of the war. Was it really fought for love, or was it a mask for greed and ego? The war became a lens through which Greeks examined their own politics. The struggles of heroes mirrored the debates of democracy. The fall of Troy warned of hubris, of the destruction that comes from excessive pride and vengeance. Later, during the Roman Empire, the myth was reshaped again. Rome claimed descent not from the Greeks, but from the Trojan survivors, casting themselves not as the descendants of conquerors, but as the noble victims who rose from tragedy. Julius Caesar claimed to trace his lineage to Aeneas and by extension to Venus herself. This was not history. It was a myth used for legitimacy, a narrative weapon as sharp as any sword. Even in the modern world, the Trojan War has never truly died. Artists, writers, and filmmakers have retold it again and again, each time reshaping it to reflect new values. Achilles becomes a tragic antihero. Helen is seen not as a passive beauty, but a woman caught in forces beyond her control. Paris, once romantic, becomes cowardly. Odysseus, clever and cold. The story evolves. It bends to fit the moment. But every retelling keeps one thing constant. Troy, that burning city by the sea, that dreamscape of love and loss, of pride and ruin. And so myth becomes more than a tale. It becomes a mirror reflecting back not what happened, but what each generation needs to believe. Whether fact, fiction, or something in between, the Trojan War remains not because it's proven, but because it's felt, a tale told in every age to remind us what it means to fight, to fall, and to be remembered. In the end, when we ask whether the Trojan War really happened, we're not just seeking facts. We're chasing something more ancient, more human, meaning. We may never know for certain if Helen truly walked the towers of Troy, or if Achilles fought beneath its walls. No clay tablet names him. No grave has yielded a shield of divine bronze. And yet we return to the story again and again. Because at its core, the Trojan War isn't about perfect records or irrefutable ruins. It's about the way memory survives when written in emotion, in honor, grief, love, and pride. The details may be blurred, exaggerated, or wholly invented, but something happened. There was a city, there was a war, and from it, the story was so powerful it shaped the identity of civilizations. Historians now believe the war, if it occurred, was likely not a single epic siege, a series of conflicts over time fought for access to trade routes, resources, or dominance in the region. Troy may have fallen not from a wooden horse, but from fire and time. Yet the myth refuses to vanish. That's because the truth of Troy lives in two places. One is archaeological, buried in earth, in pottery shards and broken ramparts. The other is emotional, carried in verses, in songs, in dreams. The poet Homer, whoever he truly was, understood this better than anyone. His words gave us a version of the war that transcends time. Troy was not just a city, it was a stage for all human drama, love and loss, glory and ruin, the things that make us ache and remember. So, did the Trojan War really happen? Yes and no. Not in the way we imagine, but not wholly imagined either. It is part truth, part memory, part mirror, and in the space where those overlap. Legends are born. Troy may have burned, its walls may have crumbled, but its story endures not because it is perfect, but because it still speaks to the fire we carry inside.